Chapter 13 of Whither Thou Goest by William le Queux. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Tom Weiss. Chapter 13. The great anarchical association of which Ferdinand Contreras was the leading spirit did not differ greatly in essential features from those tyrannical and effete institutions which it was striving to supersede. There was still the wide gulf between the classes, bridged over speciously by the fact that they addressed each other as comrade, waiving all distinctive titles. The chief addressed the educated young fisherman as Somoza shortly, which was natural, and on the other hand, Somoza addressed him, though always very respectfully, as Contreras, which would not have been at all natural under ordinary circumstances. Still, Somoza did not slap him on the back or take liberties, as he would have done with an elderly fisherman in his own rank of life. The gulf of class could not quite be crossed by dropping titles and calling each other comrade. And then there was the question of wealth. Contreras, in spite of his numerous donations to the cause, was still rich. So was Jacques. Zorrilta was moderately well off. Alvedero and Lussuet were poor. The sharing out had not begun yet. Lussuet, as we know, lived in humble lodgings in Soho, which galled him somewhat, as he was fond of comfort and the flesh-pots. Contreras, after a brief sojourn at Fonterrabia, had come back to Madrid, where he had many friends in his own sphere of life. Although not of noble birth himself, he had married a woman, a member of a family poor, but boasting of the proudest blood of Spain in its veins. At Madrid he had engaged a suite of rooms at the Ritz Hotel in the Plaza de Canovas, near the Prado Museum. Democrat and anarchist as he was in theory, the man delighted in displaying a certain amount of ostentation, whether at home or abroad. A little aware of his weakness in that direction, he consoled himself by the thought that in doing this he was throwing dust in the eyes of people of his own class, that he could more successfully carry on his propaganda, because nobody would ever suspect him of seeking to overthrow the regime under which he had prospered so exceedingly. The young Frenchwoman, Valerie Delmonte, was in Madrid at the same time also as Contreras. She was staying at an equally luxurious hostelry, the Grand Hotel de la Paix, in the Puerta del Sol. She also had a suite of rooms, imitating her illustrious chief. She chose to be known by her maiden name of Mademoiselle Valerie Delmonte. It did not suit her emancipated notions that a woman should sink her identity in that of a husband. She had borne with the infliction for 3 short years of married life. When her elderly husband, a rich Paris financier, died, she found herself a very wealthy woman. Monsieur Varenne had no near kith or kin. With the exception of a few handsome legacies, he had left all his money to this young woman, who was very handsome and still young, only in the late 20s. Contreras was an anarchist by profound and philosophical conviction. He had persuaded himself that revolution, open and brutal revolution, was the only cure for a rotten and diseased world. Valerie had arrived at the same conclusion from a merely personal standpoint, from the point of view of her own feelings. Naturally of a morbid temperament, absolutely a child of the gutter, the offspring of drunken and dissolute parents who had starved and beaten her, she had suffered no illusions as to what existence meant for the impoverished. She was a sharp-witted child, with plenty of brain power, and a marvelous capacity for self-education. At the age of 12 her parents had sold her for a paltry sum to the proprietor of a travelling circus. This man had perceived at once that there was plenty of grit in the precocious child. He had got her very cheap. If he trained her carefully, he might make a good deal of money out of her. The precocious little Valerie left her parents without the slightest regret. Her life had been one of long torture with them. The circus proprietor was a big, burly man, not destitute of a rough geniality. There was a hard look in his eyes, a dogged squareness of the jaw that suggested a latent brutality. On the whole, however, he was a welcome relief from her former torturers, who had never thrown a kind word to her from the day of her birth. Sometimes he was generous, sometimes he was brutal, as the mood took him. Often he swore at her till she trembled in every limb. Occasionally in his cups he beat her, but he was always sorry the next day and did his best to make amends. In short, he was a ruffian with a certain amount of decent feeling and an uncertain temperament. She stayed with him till she was 17. She might have stayed with him forever had not a sudden severance been put to their relations by the man's sudden death brought about prematurely by his constant indulgence in alcohol. Valerie could never recall the years that succeeded without a shudder. The circus was broken up, she was left helpless and friendless. It was during those terrible years that the iron entered her soul, when she experienced the keen, cruel suffering of the really poor, when she went to bed night after night, cold and hungry after tramping the streets in vain for work. A weaker spirit would have succumbed to the temptation that was always at hand, for she was a very attractive girl. But she was resolved, with her indomitable grit, to keep herself pure. She turned away disdainfully from the leering old men, the callous young ones who accosted her as she paced the streets in her restless tramp for an honest living. Better the river than that. After many vicissitudes, she came to anchor at last. She was then about 22. She was very clever at educating herself. She had taught herself to sing, she had taught herself to play the piano, she had taught herself to dance. She got an engagement at one of the minor halls in Paris to do a turn which combined singing and dancing. She was very pretty and attractive. In a small way she made a name. At the end of 3 months the manager trebled her salary. To this minor music hall came one night the rich financier, a somewhat shady one if the truth must be told, Monsieur Varenne, a man of about 55 who had never married. He was greatly attracted by this elegant young girl. Her voice was small, her dancing was nothing great, but there was an indefinable charm about her that appealed to his somewhat jaded senses. He obtained an introduction through the manager, who was only too anxious to oblige such a well-known personage. He invited her to supper. She accepted the invitation graciously, but coldly. Her coldness inflamed him the more. When they met, he was surprised at her cleverness, the correctness with which she expressed herself. This was certainly no ordinary girl of the music halls. "Tell me something about yourself, my dear," he said as they sat over their coffee. "I did not expect to find you such a charming companion." Valerie smiled a little bitterly. "I have not very much to tell. I expect my lot has been like that of many thousands in this delightful world. I am a child of the gutter. My father and mother beat and starved me, and sold me for a paltry sum to the proprietor of a travelling circus. It wasn't exactly a rosy life then, but it was paradise to where I had been. He died, I was thrown on my beam ends. I can't tell you what I have been through for the last few years. I couldn't bear to talk of it. I have suffered everything that the poor have to suffer in such profusion: cold, hunger, the most absolute misery. And at last," she looked round at the luxurious appointments of the restaurant a little disdainfully, "I find myself in receipt of a decent salary, and the guest of a rich man who has pressed upon me every dainty. And I have so often wanted a meal." Varenne was a very kindly man, in spite of his somewhat sharp ways in business. Those last few pathetic words had gone straight to his heart. She had often wanted a meal, and she was a most attractive girl. Many would have called her beautiful. "It is a sad history, my poor child," he said sympathetically. He paused a moment before he put the delicate question. "And during those terrible years, when you suffered hunger and privation, you kept yourself straight? It would have been so easy to go wrong, so excusable under the circumstances." "Of course," she answered, and there was a note of wounded pride, of indignation, in her voice. "I am not that sort of woman. Better the river than that. I might give myself to a man out of love or gratitude, but never merely for money." It was a new experience for the wealthy financier. Here was a girl who had just stepped off the platform of a music hall, where she was, no doubt, earning a very modest salary, who had grit and backbone in her, and, moreover, a proper pride and self-respect. He had, of course, with an easy confidence of a man of the world, imagined the usual termination to such an adventure. But he recognized at once that he could not make any proposition of the kind he meditated. He pressed her hand tenderly at parting, and arranged a further meeting. They met several times, and Varenne went through agonies of indecision. But the attraction was too strong, and at last he asked her to marry him. It was that or losing her altogether. And did it matter much? His world would laugh at him as a matter of course. Say he had got into his dotage, and a girl who was young enough to be his daughter. There is no fool like an old fool, he told himself rather ruefully. But she had so subjugated him that he was quite a humble wooer in spite of the enormous advantages he was offering her. "Of course, I am an old man. I cannot expect you to have any real affection for me," he said. She met his glance quite frankly. "I have never been in love with anybody. My life has been too hard to permit me to indulge in the softer emotions. But I like you very much. I have always hated rich men. They think they can buy anything with their gold. You are a rich man, I know. You have told me so yourself. But you have a kind nature and a good heart." "And can you overlook the disparity of years?" he questioned, still very humble. "I am 22, but I don't think I am very young. I am old in experience and bitterness. Well, if you care to risk the experiment, I will be your wife. I will do my best to make you happy." They were married. And this marriage was the turning point in Valerie's life. If everything had gone smoothly, she might have forgotten those bitter experiences, outlived her still more bitter rancor against the prosperous and well-to-do. Unfortunately, the friends of Monsieur Varenne would not forgive him for this false step, so unpardonable in a man of his intelligence and position. He was a fool, that was clear, but they were not going to abet him in his mad folly. Their doors were shut against his wife, this creature of the music halls, to whom he was going to leave his fortune. After this bitter experience, the iron entered even deeper into her soul. Her husband was kindness and tenderness itself. In his devotion to his young wife, he paid no attention to the fact that he had cut himself off from his old friends, his old social life. He was ready to comply with her slightest wish. He showered on her the most costly gifts. His purse was absolutely at her disposal. She had everything that wealth could give, except the one thing she craved, to mix on equal terms with these people who despised her. When the kindly old man died, she mourned him sincerely. If she had never loved him in the true sense of the word, she had felt for him a very warm and grateful affection. On his deathbed, she had faltered forth a few words of self-reproach, had blamed herself for taking advantage of his generosity, for not having sufficiently counted the cost to himself. On this point he had reassured her. "I have been very happy, my dear, happier than I ever expected to be. I would not have changed anything." She came into that considerable fortune which was of so little use to her. During her few years of married life, she had educated herself into a woman of considerable accomplishments, for she had a very quick and acute intelligence. Her socialist proclivities were now fully developed, after the scurvy treatment at the hands of her husband's friends. The circles where these doctrines were preached readily opened their doors to an attractive and enthusiastic young woman whose wealth would be very useful for propaganda. She was more than the equal of these purse-proud parvenus who would not accept her acquaintance in intellect and behaviour. She felt it bitterly. Very soon she came under the influence of Contraras, who was possessed of great personal magnetism. His recent arguments, his fiery eloquence, quickly led her a step further, from socialism to anarchy. In a very short space she became one of the leading spirits of the brotherhood. As the old regime would not receive her, she would do her best to overthrow it, and assert the doctrine of absolute equality. Contraras came frequently to the Grand Hôtel de l'Épare to visit his young colleague. He had very charming manners, this elderly enthusiast, and Valerie liked him very much apart from his principles. He was one of the few rich men she had ever known, her late husband being another, whom she did not despise. He was no mere hoarder of wealth, using it as a means to enslave his less fortunate fellow creatures. Contraras came in one afternoon in a very cheerful mood. She looked at him eagerly. She could read his countenance pretty well by now. "You have something to tell me, Contraras?" The old man smiled. "Yes, my dear, I have got what we wanted. You can walk in boldly. There will be no smuggling through the back door, although we could have managed that if the other had failed." "Did you get it in the quarter you expected?" "Yes, I had a little tussle with Del Pineda, but I overcame his scruples. Besides, he is considerably in my debt. I assured him that he would never be accused of complicity, that I would take all the blame on my own shoulders." He rubbed his hands and chuckled softly. "What does Contraras, a man of means and position, with powerful connections in Spain, know of the secret sentiments of Mademoiselle Delmonte, a charming young lady of wealth whom he has met abroad? Mademoiselle Delmonte asks for his good offices in a certain matter of a most apparently innocent nature. He places himself at her disposal, and secures what she wants through the agency of a certain duke who is equally ignorant of her real purposes." A dreamy look stole into the young woman's eyes. She spoke in a low voice, as if she were muttering to herself. "A week to wait, only just one little week, and then if all goes as we think and hope, the dawn of a new era. But I shall not live to see it." End of chapter 13. Recording by Tom Weiss, tomsaudioBooks.com. Chapter 14 of Whither Thou Goest by William le Queux. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Tom Weiss. Chapter 14. Moreno met Isabel and her maid at the railway station, and drove them to the home of his friends the Godwins, who lived in a respectable but not particularly fashionable quarter of Madrid. Mrs. Godwin, a buxom and kind-faced woman, received the girl with open arms. Mr. Godwin had discreetly absented himself during the first meeting of the two women. "So delighted to see you, Miss Clandon. I was a very intimate friend of Andreas' mother. Any friend of his is very welcome. I shall do my best to make you happy during your stay here. I am afraid the accommodation is not what you have been used to. We are a little cramped for room." A dear, good, honest bourgeois creature. Isabel took to her at once. She felt the milieu was not quite what she could have desired, but Moreno had done all he could, most probably out of his old friendship for Farquhar. Whatever discomforts she might have to endure, well, she had brought them on herself by embarking on this daring adventure. Mr. Godwin came in presently, a large, heavy man, who greeted her with great gravity. She learned afterwards that he had been connected with the wine trade, and had retired from active business on a respectable competence. Moreno took his departure as soon as he could. He had several matters on hand, besides looking after a wandering maiden of a romantic turn of mind. Isabel stayed him at the door. "When am I going to see Guy?" she whispered. The young journalist looked at her kindly. He remembered his own too short-lived romance. That whisper had come straight from her heart. "Ah, that is for you," he said. "You know, you confessed you were a little doubtful about how he would look upon it. Will you ask Lady Mary to write him the news, or would you rather that I should?" Isabel interrupted him eagerly. "Oh, would you? Lady Mary is a darling, and devoted to us both. But if I write to her, and she has to write to Guy, it may be ages before we meet. And besides," she added with the unconscious guile of a woman, "in certain things men are so much better diplomatists than women. I am sure you could put everything from a reasonable point of view, present everything in quite a favourable light. I do not want him to think I am a masculine sort of a person, an enlightened female who goes tearing about all over the world after a man she loves." Moreno was a very kind-hearted fellow. He could not resist that wistful look in the beautiful dark eyes. The girl was alone in the world. She had just lost her father, Guy was now her sheet anchor. "I say, if you want to see him quickly, why not send a note round to the Embassy, just giving him your address and saying simply, 'I am here'?" But Isobel rather shrank from that. It seemed too bold, perhaps a little unmaidenly. She had always been educated in the belief that a woman should never make advances. Advances might be made through a third party, perhaps, if they were made with discretion. "But you could explain it all so much better than I could, Mr. Moreno, how the whole thing was led up to by your letter to Lady Mary." Moreno looked at his watch. "I was going to leave Madrid in half an hour. Well, I can catch a train 3 hours later. It won't make much difference. I will be off at once to the Embassy and catch Rossett there, if not at his flat. You, of course, can see him at any time, today or tomorrow?" "A thousand thanks," replied Isobel, with her charming smile. "Yes, I shall not stir out much anyway, but I will keep in the 2 whole days. Mrs. Godwin, I warn you, will insist on showing you the sights of Madrid." "I will resist her," said Isobel firmly. Moreno smiled and said good-bye. It was a little pathetic, he thought, the patient, loving woman ready to wait the man's convenience. Ever the way with true love. A brief drive to the Embassy in the Calle Fernando el Santo, a hastily pencilled note sent up to Rossett. Half an hour later, the 2 men were seated at a different rendezvous, for this time Moreno was not in his working man's dress. He had to be very cautious. Moreno went to the point at once. "I have news that will startle you, Mr. Rossett. Your fiancée, Miss Clandon, is in Madrid at this moment." He named the respectable but unfashionable quarter in which the girl had taken up her abode. "What?" shouted Guy Rossett in his astonishment. It was just the same ejaculation he had used when he learned that Violet Hargrave was in Spain. The vocabulary of the average Englishman is very limited when he has to express sudden emotion, and Guy was quite the average type. "Of course you are very surprised. Well, I'm afraid it is all due to me. You remember some time ago I begged you to get out of this place. You refused. I took it on myself to write to your sister, to use your father's influence to get you recalled. That fell through too." "It was very kind of you to interfere in my private affairs, Mr. Moreno," observed Rossett stiffly. "You are a bit of a responsibility to me, Mr. Rossett," replied the journalist in his usual imperturbable fashion. "I will tell you frankly I should be very glad to see the back of you tomorrow, for your own sake." He added in a lower voice, "Still more for the sake of the girl who loves you as much as you love her." "Forgive me," cried Rossett hastily. "I quite appreciate that you mean very well to both of us." "Thank you," said Moreno. "Well, to get on with my story. I have a very old chum, one Maurice Farquhar, who happens to be a cousin of your fiancée. One night in his chambers I hinted that danger was threatening you here. It seems he told Miss Clandon. As I have stated, I wrote to your sister. The 2 women put their heads together. Miss Clandon's father died. She had no longer any ties binding her to England. She was mad to come out here to be near you. As men of the world, we might say, the unreasoning caprice of a very loving woman." "It was very sweet and dear of her," said Guy. There was a little break in his voice as he spoke. "But I am interrupting you in your story. Please go on." "There is not much more to tell. As I have said, the 2 women put their heads together. Lady Mary sent for Farquhar to consult him as to how Miss Clandon could get to Spain. She felt if she consulted you, you would, under the circumstances, have vetoed the project altogether." "I don't think there is the slightest doubt I should," said Rossett quite frankly. "I agree. Well, they were not going to give you the choice. They took matters into their own hands. Farquhar knew nothing about Spain. He wrote to me to ask me if I could help them. Well, I helped them. I went over to London, saw your sister and Miss Clandon, and arranged for the journey. I met her at the station to-day, took her to the houses of some very respectable English people whom I have known from my boyhood, not people of your class nor of Miss Clandon's, but I think there she will be very quiet and comfortable." Guy Rossett leaned across the table and held out his hand. "A thousand thanks, Mr. Moreno. After this we must be firm friends. My brave little Isabel, how plucky and daring of her! And you took all this trouble!" There was no suspicion in his frank tones, but Moreno liked to clear up everything as he went on. "Yes, it took up a good deal of my time, but I didn't grudge it. I saw your fiancée and sister dining one night with you at the Savoy, but had never spoken to them in my life. But Farquhar is an old chum of mine. He has done me some very good turns. I was pleased to return the compliment." There was a brief pause before Moreno spoke again. "I left Miss Clandon a little time ago. She is longing to see you. I suggested she should send round a note to you. She seemed a little fearful of what you might think of her hasty action. She begged me to come round and explain matters. That is why I am here. Here is her address." "Again 1,000 thanks." Rossett looked at his watch. "Unfortunately, I have to dine at the Embassy tonight, and there is no getting out of that. We are the slaves of duty. I have only just time to get back and dress. I will leave as soon after dinner as I decently can, and go round to her." "Away with you. Duty calls," said Moreno, rising briskly. "I will send a note round to her saying I have seen you, and that you will be there tonight." It was late when Rossett, hurrying as fast as he could, entered the small drawing-room of the flat tenanted by the respectable Godwins. Isobel was alone. The worthy couple, with commendable tact, had absented themselves. Moreno had told them just as much as it was well for them to know, and they were not very inquisitive people. It was a very delightful meeting. They had been longing for each other since they last parted. They exchanged their vows of love all over again. "And you are sure you are not angry with me, Guy?" asked Isobel, as they sat hand in hand on the rather hard sofa. "Angry, my brave little darling? Why should I be? But I say, this is not the sort of place for you, you know. Have you brought a maid with you?" "Yes, our old parlour maid, Ethel. I don't suppose you remember her." "Yes, I do. Well, you must go to the Ritz or one of the good hotels." "Oh, please no, dearest. I have no chaperon, you see, and it might look queer. Besides, I don't want to meet a lot of people and have to explain things. I would much prefer to stay here incognita. Dear Mrs. Godwin is quite a motherly old soul, and knows nothing of what is going on in the great world except what she learns from the newspapers. And I am not so far off, after all. You can come and see me sometimes." "Every day, darling," cried Rossett. On reflection, he was inclined to think that, under the very peculiar circumstances, Isobel's course of action was the right one. If she blossomed forth at a fashionable hotel, a great deal would have to be explained. In a censorious and conventional world, young women, however pure in heart, cannot afford to be adventurous. As they sat on the sofa, she told him at great length of her visit to Ticehurst Park, and the Earl's consent to their engagement, of his endeavour to get her to use her influence to lure Guy from his post, of her refusal, in which she had been staunchly supported by her father. She had told him briefly of this at the funeral, but he had been so pressed for time that she had only supplied him with the barest details. "The old dad, he was always great at a bargain, but this time you got the better of him, my darling." Then he put his hand in his breast pocket and drew forth a letter. "By Jove, I had very nearly forgotten. A letter received this morning from that dear old Aunt Henrietta. I won't read you all of it. There are yards, but I'll just run through a passage that concerns us." This was the passage he read. "I hear a great deal from Mary, who, as you know, is a most indefatigable correspondent, about your fiancée, Isobel Clandon. She describes her as a most sweet and lovable girl. There are always the two types in the Rossett family, the practicable and the romantic. You, Mary, and myself belong to the latter. I married for love, Mary would have done, and you are going to. I hear also your post is rather a dangerous one, and that they have tried to get you recalled, but that you will not hear of it. Well, I admire your spirit and sense of duty. Still, as soon as you can retire with honour, do so. Now that your father has given his consent, there is nothing to wait for. I shall make the way easy for you, as I have always tried to do. Bring your Isabel to see me at the first opportunity. I am longing to make her acquaintance." "What a darling!" cried Isabel enthusiastically. "Well, anyway, there are 3 dear people in the present Rossett family, your Aunt Mary and yourself. And Lord Saxham is not so bad after all." In her happiness she freely forgave the old gentleman his former hostility, his attempt to drive a bargain with her. "No, he's by no means so bad when you get to know him, to pierce through the crust, as it were. He's a sort of cross between the practical and romantic Rossetts," said Guy. They talked for a long time about their future plans. When Isabel laid her head upon her pillow that night, she was happier than she had ever been since the day her dear old father died. End of chapter 14. Recording by Tom Weiss, Tom'sAudiobooks.com. Chapter 15 of Whither Thou Goest by William le Queux. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Tom Weiss. Chapter 15. A week had passed since the conversation between Valerie Delmonte and Contraras had taken place. A great function was on at the Royal Palace tonight. All the elite of Madrid would be there. For this special occasion, the leading members of the Spanish section had shifted from Fonterrabia to the capital. Zorrilta, Alvedero, Violet Hargrave, Andreas Moreno, Contraras, and Valerie Delmonte had already taken up their residence there. It was the night of the great coup, on the successful development of which depended the dawn of the new era. Moreno had had a busy day. Thanks to the noble-spirited action of Mademoiselle Delmonte, who had taken the entire execution of the coup upon herself, he was spared any active participation in it. Violet Hargrave, who had been originally named as an assistant, was also dispensed with. At 11 o'clock in the morning he was seated in the private room of the head of the Spanish Secret Service. There was also present the head of the police. The 3 men talked together for a very considerable time. Moreno was attired in his shabby workman's garb. He had on also a false beard and moustache. When the interview was terminated, Moreno rose and turned to the chief of police. "You have thought it all out, then? You know she will come with the Duchess del Pineda." "She will be watched from the moment she enters the palace to the moment she leaves it," was the chief's confident reply. "And you say the Duchess is quite ignorant of her intentions?" It was the chief of the Secret Service who spoke. "I will swear to the innocence of the Duchess, also to that of the Duke. They are simply tools. They have been made use of by a superior intelligence, by a man who has a strong hold over the Duke. I wish, Mr. Moreno, you were able to take us a little more into your confidence. Would it not be possible to bag the whole lot tonight?" The chief of police rubbed his hands at the thought. "Ah, that would be a fine idea. And I suppose, Mr. Moreno, you have it in your power to enable us to do so?" "Gently, gentlemen, if you please. Don't be ungrateful. I am helping you somewhat tonight. And because I am doing this, you want to rush things," answered the young journalist in his usual quiet way. "Now, look you, much as I desire to serve you, I have a very tender regard for my own skin." "Naturally," cried the Secret Service man, and the chief of police echoed him. "The secret of this project tonight has been entrusted to a good many people," continued Moreno. "If it fails, as you promised me it will fail, 2 things will occur to the mind of the chief. One, that the Brotherhood has been betrayed by one in their councils, the other that your spies noticed something suspicious in the behaviour of the woman, and that she was arrested on the strength of that suspicious behaviour." The 2 men nodded their heads. They began to see the drift of his observations. "I was at first designed to take part in this project, but the original programme was altered. Had it been adhered to, I think I could have enabled you to bag the whole lot, at any rate most of them, and yet escape scot-free myself, of course with your cooperation." "We dare not ask you to dispose your plan?" insinuated the Secret Service man gently. Moreno shook his head. "I think not. But if this coup fails, there will be another planned shortly. By that time my ideas will be perfected, and I trust I shall be able to do what you want, and escape with a whole skin. Only one member of the Brotherhood will be here tonight. The others are scattered about. Suspicion would fall at once upon me if everyone except myself were taken." "We could work that out pretty easily, could we not?" queried the Chief of Police eagerly. "I think not," was Moreno's answer. "You would have got this lot out of the way, but there are a few members of the Brotherhood left in London, and every man has a knife handy. I must show a clean sheet to those who remain at large. Please trust me, and I will shortly do it in my own way." Moreno left after cordial handshaking. Both the chiefs were men of considerable astuteness and great experience, but they agreed that there was a certain subtlety about this young man, a certain suggestion of strength and confidence that won their admiration. Moreno perhaps did not repose quite so much confidence in them as they did in himself. "I hope to heaven they won't bungle it at the last minute," he said to himself as he walked along. "If I were dealing with the French police, I shouldn't have a doubt." He walked down the Puerta del Sol, past the Grand Hotel de la Paix. He saw the tall form of Contraras enter the vestibule. He shrugged his shoulders, and a look of regret stole over his face. He is going to hearten her up for this night's work, the old devil, while he stands safely outside and looks on. Poor little woman, I wish I could save her. But how can you save a fanatic? So ran his thoughts. Why in the name of wonder does a woman who has got everything in the world she requires want to mix herself up with this wretched and bloodthirsty crew? She must lie on the bed she has made, and it will be a pretty hard one, I should wager. Moreno walked swiftly in the direction of a poor quarter of the town. He entered the humble abode of an inferior member of the Spanish Secret Service, where he doffed his working man's garb and assumed his ordinary clothes. Later on he saw Violet Hargrave, who was living close to him. Violet seemed very restless and perturbed. "This is the great night," she said by way of greeting. "I wonder if it will come off all right." "I should say there is every chance it will, unless Valerie's nerve fails her at the last moment," was Moreno's diplomatic answer. Mrs. Hargrave gave a little shudder. Her pretty, delicate face went a shade paler. "I cannot help feeling glad that I wasn't brought into it." Moreno bent upon her his keen glance. "And yet I should not put you down as a very tender-hearted person." "I don't know that I am, or should be under certain circumstances. But I have no grudge against these people, no particular wrong to avenge. Aren't you really glad you are out of it?" "I suppose in a way I am. Still, one feels a bit of a coward in letting Valerie take all the risk. It seems taking advantage of her bravery to snatch at the chance of avoiding all danger for oneself. I shall sit up very late on the chance of hearing the news." "On the contrary, I think I shall go to bed early," said Moreno. "We shall hear nothing tonight in this distant quarter, and in the morning there will be the news, or no news at all. The chief will let us know." The great Contraras, very upright and vigorous for his age, was shown into Mademoiselle Delmonte's sitting room. She sprang up eagerly at his entrance. "I am so glad you have come. You are a little late, are you not? Luncheon will be served in a few moments." He could see she was very restless, and her cheeks were pale. There was a strange, almost unnatural brilliance in her dark eyes. Her voice was jerky. He took both her hands in his and pressed them tenderly. "You are not afraid, Valerie?" He was a fanatic, bold, brutal, and ruthless in his fanaticism, ready to sacrifice anything and everybody to the one absorbing idea. But at the sight of those pale cheeks, that quivering mouth, a momentary regret assailed him. He was a father, and this beautiful young woman was young enough to be his daughter. "We ought to have had a man for this job," he said, speaking a little hoarsely. "But you know you chose it yourself. You would not even have another associated with you." "I know." She tried to laugh lightly, but there was a quaver in the laugh. "I do not regret. I am not really afraid. But I suppose every soldier on his first battlefield has inward terrors that he cannot repress. I am a soldier of the Revolution, and tonight is my first battlefield." "And you feel those tremors, eh?" "Just a little, although I blush for them.
But don't let us think of this. Ah, here comes lunch."
They sat down to the meal. She was a very abstemious woman, and rarely partook of stimulants. But in honor of Contraras' visit she had ordered a bottle of champagne. Under its exhilarating influence her jangled nerves readjusted themselves, and she became her natural self. The colour returned to her cheeks. She raised her glass and nodded to her guest. "To the new world, born upon the ruins of the old." "Amen to that wish!" cried Contraras fervently, as he drank his wine in one long draught. There was a long pause, which she broke abruptly.
"I think I have told you I made my will in London last year."
Contraras nodded. "Yes, you told me that."
"But I did not tell you the details. I have left all my money in the hands of the public trustee, to divide amongst certain charities. As private fortunes go, it is a fair one, but what a small sum to go to the alleviation of this vast amount of human misery!"
"You could not have made a better use of it," said Contraras appreciatively.
"To you, my dear friend, I have left £20,000 to devote to whatever purpose you think fit. Of course you will apply that money to the spreading of the propaganda."
"I much appreciate your kind thought, my dear Valerie. It is just like you. But may the day be far distant when—"
She raised her hand. "We will speak no more of that, please. I wonder what will be the result of tonight."
"Success!" cried Contraras confidently. "Success!" A few minutes later he rose to go. "The Duchess will call for you in her carriage. Once arrived at the Palace, keep under her wing for some time so as to avoid suspicion. Then seize your time and opportunity. Would you like me to come round and see you before you start? But I shall look out for you at the Palace." For a moment she did not answer him. She was pursuing the train of her own thoughts.
"I never told you I had my fortune told by a gipsy when I was 16. Would you like to know what she predicted?"
"If you wish," replied Contraras politely. He had no respect for gipsies or their prophecies.
"Ah, I see it won't interest you. I don't think you believe much in the spiritual side of existence. Still, I will tell it. It will not take a moment. Up to the present it has come remarkably true. This gipsy, she was a very old woman, predicted that I should have a very hard life for some years, then would come some years of great good fortune, and then equally great tribulation."
Contraras smiled. "My dear child, she probably predicted precisely the same things hundreds of times to her clients. The veil of the future is not to be lifted by a wandering beggar woman."
"Of course, I knew you would not be impressed, or perhaps you would just say it to cheer me."
She had forgotten his question. Should he come and see her again before she started for the Palace? He repeated it.
"No, my good friend, I would rather not. If all goes well, we shall meet again often. If not, we will say good-bye here. 1,000 thanks for your friendship and kindness."
Could fanaticism go further? She was thanking this hardened old schemer for his friendship and kindness that were ready to sacrifice her at any moment for his own ends. End of chapter 15. Recording by Tom Weiss, Tom'sAudiobooks.com. Chapter 16 of Whither Thou Goest by William le Queux. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Tom Weiss. Chapter 16. Moreno had declared to Violet Hargrave that he proposed to go to bed early and wait till tomorrow for the news. When he spoke, that had been his original intention. But as the evening drew on, he began to feel a certain restlessness stirring in him. Certain things were about to happen, or, as he hoped, to be frustrated. He could hardly compose himself to sleep under the unusual circumstances. He would go out and form one of the undistinguished crowd that clustered round the Palace gates. If anything dramatic happened, he could not fail to be aware of it. The news would spread like wildfire. On his arrival, he caught sight of a woman closely veiled standing close to him. He recognized her at once. It was evident that Mrs. Hargrave could no more endure to stay indoors than he could.
He moved up a few paces and spoke to her in English, practically their native tongue. "The same sudden impulse seized both of us," he whispered. "Well, it is a very orderly crowd. I don't think we shall be pushed or knocked about. We shall enjoy the sight of the grandees arriving. By the way, it is a pity we were not sent an invitation. Then we could have seen it from the inside."
Violet Hargrave whispered back, "I simply couldn't stay indoors. My nerves seem on edge tonight." "Mine are a bit out of time, too," answered Moreno in a low voice. And while they were waiting, Moreno indulged in several philosophical reflections. A curious and not ill-natured crowd was gathered round the palace, something like the throng that gathers round a wedding. There was no harm in these good-humoured laughing persons, mainly of the lower order. They were not envious of the people who went inside, these men in court costume, these women of another world, daintily attired. They discussed and admired the good looks of the men, the exquisite costumes of the women. If the court chamberlain had suddenly appeared, and in the name of their majesties bade them enter the royal precincts in a spirit of perfect equality with the other guests, they would have been very embarrassed and, save for a few adventurous spirits, have declined the invitation. They would have felt out of place. From what causes arose this antagonism amongst the clever extremists of the proletariat toward the more fortunate ones of the earth? Moreno was puzzled to find a solution. Envy, perhaps, was the contributing cause. And yet the ordinary man who dines at a common eating-house is not always envious of the man who eats a sumptuous luncheon at the Ritz or Carlton. The middle-class, prosperous, professional man does not always gnash his teeth when he thinks of a nobleman, possibly his client, who has a rent roll of 100,000 a year. Moreno was very just. There was a time when he had had to fare very frugally, and he had not complained. Things had improved. When the fancy took him, he would indulge in a good dinner, a bottle of champagne, and an excellent cigar. Was he hurting the toiling millions very much if he occasionally indulged in these luxuries? Were the few fortunate ones of the earth, and after all they were very few, hurting him if they indulged in them every day? Night was slowly settling over the city. Far away from this scene of revel and display, some thousands of humble workers had eaten their frugal suppers and were preparing for bed. If all the money that was to be spent upon this function had been shared between them, would they have been much the richer? Champagne, excellent cigars, and good dinners could not be given to every creature on God's earth. That was an inexorable economic law which no revolutionist could alter. He was raised from his reveries by a light touch on his arm. "Who are these two men?" It was Violet Hargrave who spoke. "Somehow they look people of importance." Moreno recognized them at once as they drove slowly through. The chief of the Secret Service, the head of the police. He was glad that they were on the scene early. They might not have quite the perfect methods of the corresponding French organizations, but perhaps they would justify themselves before the night was over. "I don't know them from Adam, but, as you say, they certainly look persons of importance, especially the fat one." Always suspicious, he wondered if Mrs. Hargrave was trying to draw him, herself knowing who they were. Anyway, she had failed. He was not to be caught by a leading question like that. Then presently she nudged him. "Look, look, the chief!" Yes, it was Contraras, driving in a humble cab. His fine, lined face showed clear against the waning light. "Wonderful man! The brains of 60, the fire and energy of 20," said Moreno glibly. He spoke with all the enthusiasm of a true son of the Revolution. Mrs. Hargrave made no comment. Equipage after equipage rolled up, containing fair women and brave men. The palace was one blaze of light. The crowd drew closer, enjoying the spectacle of the arriving guests, and it seemed a crowd that was at once good-humoured and appreciative, if at times critical. Moreno turned to his companion. "I say, it's a bit of a shame that you and I are not inside instead of here, eh? I think Contraras might have worked that while he was about it." Mrs. Hargrave smiled back. She was very attracted by this black-browed young Spaniard. "My dear friend, under the new regime, we shall all go to court.
To the court of Contraras, I suppose?" "Something of that sort," answered Violet, letting herself go a little. "And Madame Contraras, more aristocratic than any queen, will smile condescendingly, and the pretty daughter will turn up her nose at us." The conversation was getting dangerous. Mrs. Hargrave must be checked in her impulsive moods, which, he honestly admitted, were very rare. "Ah, if I could see dear old Contraras in that position, I would die happy," he exclaimed with a splendid mendacity. Mrs. Hargrave stole a quiet glance at him. "Yes, he is very wonderful, is he not? But I can't honestly say I like his womenkind. They have no sympathy with his aspirations." As they were speaking, a very gorgeous carriage rolled up. It contained the Duchess del Pineda and Valerie Delmonte. The Duke had not accompanied them. He had pleaded indisposition, but probably prudence had dictated his absence. Anyway, if certain things happened, it would be possible for him to plead a successful alibi. "Look, look!" cried Violet Hargrave, a little excitedly for her. "Valerie Delmonte!" Moreno, the kindly-hearted, felt a spasm of pity as he gazed upon the face of the handsome, fanatical young Frenchwoman whom that wily old Contraras had subjugated to his evil will. "Poor child," he said aloud, for the benefit of his companion. "I can only hope she will not lose her nerve. It was a man's job, but she would insist upon having it." There was a little lull in the procession of carriages, and then there drove up one conveying Guy Rossett and a colleague. The Ambassador had already arrived with his wife. Moreno stole a glance at his companion. She was heavily veiled, but he could see that her face had grown pale, that a sad look had come into her eyes. "Our admirable young diplomatist," whispered the young man. "Well, Madrid is not a very safe place for him." "But he is in no danger tonight, I take it?" came back the answer in a whisper as low as his own. "I should say not. For the present we have left him out of our calculations. We are flying at higher game. He will hardly come within the sphere of Valerie's operations. His chief may, I doubt even that." Mrs. Hargrave made no comment. Presently Moreno spoke in the same low whisper. "You have no great affection for Mr. Rossett, I take it?" "No, I have not any great affection for Mr. Rossett." "And yet you were once very good friends." Mrs. Hargrave stiffened a little. "You seem to know a great deal of my private affairs. Yes, we once were very good friends. He knew my husband long before I married him. I fancy I have told you that." Moreno was not to be daunted by her aloof attitude. He was never wanting in enterprise. "I should not be surprised if, at the present moment, you hated him." "Perhaps you are right," was the curt answer. Moreno indulged in a quiet inward chuckle. If she had known that Isobel Clandon was established so close to her lover, that through his adroit manipulation of affairs they were meeting every day, her hatred must have expressed itself more heartily. Valerie Delmonte, under the wing of the unsuspecting Duchess, was now within the palace. She had only once before looked upon a scene approaching this, and it had been much less brilliant. Once, early in their married life, her husband had taken her to one of the President's receptions in Paris. It was easy, in his position, to secure the entrée for himself and his wife. She remembered that evening well. Never had she felt more humiliated. Half a dozen times old Monsieur Varenne had introduced her to some of his acquaintances. There was a formal bow interchanged, and nothing beyond. One and all they had sheered off. Even in a republican and democratic country, these purse-proud citizens would have nothing to do with the girl who had come from the music halls. She recalled how, when she reached home that night, she had burst into a fit of wild sobbing, and her kind elderly husband had tried to comfort her. "Calm thyself, ma chérie. We will not go to these hateful places again. We will lead our own life." Tonight, how different! A court, one of the oldest in Europe, reflecting that atmosphere of pomp and state associated with long-descended royalty. The kindly young king, his British-born queen, chatting graciously with their favoured guests. Men in resplendent uniforms and orders, great ladies of the highest Spanish nobility. What a contrast to the homely reception of the President in those far-off days! Then she had been escorted by a very wealthy but somewhat shady financier, whose influence had not been sufficient to enable her to scale the social heights to which she had aspired. Tonight she was under the wing of a popular chaperon, in whose veins ran the proudest blood of Spain. The Duchess, acting according to instructions, introduced her to everybody she came across. Mademoiselle de Monde, handsome, brilliant, and vivacious, was an immediate success. This aristocratic assemblage, ignorant of her antecedents, only recognizing that she was under the wing of the popular Duchess, took her at her real valuation. Being a woman, she was naturally pleased with her momentary success. But she was sensible enough to know to what she owed it. If these people who were flattering her now had known of her lowly origin, how she had graduated through the circus and the music hall to the possession of wealth, they would have turned their backs on her, as the purse-proud parvenus had done in the democratic salons of the French President. These bitter reflections rather tended to harden than soften her resolution. Tonight she was an avenging angel, bent upon the task of making these insolent people atone for the insults heaped upon the lowly born. Once in her triumphant progress she came near to Contraras, who was standing alone, surveying the brilliant scene with his keen, deep-set eyes. She disengaged herself from the arm of her companion, a handsome young man of some standing in Spanish society. "Excuse me a moment. I see an old friend to whom I must say a few words." "What do you think of it all?" she whispered as she held out her hand. "What I have always thought of such spectacles as these," he whispered back. "These besotted creatures feast and dance and make merry, without a thought of their oppressed and toiling fellow creatures." He spoke intensely, in the most bitter spirit of his gloomy fanaticism. She could not linger. "My nerves are in perfect order," she assured him as she turned away. He smiled at her kindly as she passed on. The amiable and innocent Duchess had performed the duties of chaperon so well, had introduced her to so many people, that it was a long time before Valerie could shake herself free. It was a very crowded assemblage. If she could once break away, she would be free to roam where she pleased. The moment came at last, close upon midnight. She was alone and mistress of her own movements. Her thoughts were no longer distracted by the idle chatter of some companion forced upon her. Slowly she edged her way towards the royal circle. Progress was a little difficult, but at last she stood within a few feet of the King and Queen. She stood for a few moments, perhaps summoning up her courage. Then her hand stole towards her pocket. Before she could reach it, a little cordon was formed around her, a cordon of 6 men in ordinary evening dress. The hand of one of the men gripped hers, and held it in a grasp of iron. "Come quietly, mademoiselle," whispered a voice in her ear. "We have followed you round all the evening. We fancied there was something suspicious about you. We may, of course, be mistaken, but in these troublous times we have to be very careful. We will take you to a private room and have you searched. Of course, if nothing is found upon you, you will go free, and we will make you handsome amends." Valerie gave a little choking sob. The gipsy's prophecy had come true. Several years of hard life, a few years of good fortune, and then great tribulation. "I came here with the Duchess del Pineda," she said in a broken voice, hardly knowing what she was saying. "Do you dare to suspect?" It was the head of the police who held her wrist in that iron grasp. He spoke in a suave voice. "Mademoiselle, we always suspect in our profession. For the Duchess del Pineda I have the highest respect. Will you consent to come quietly? If we are in the wrong, you have nothing to fear." She turned with them without a word. She had failed miserably. The upholders of law and order had scored signally over the scattered and imperfect organization of the Brotherhood. Between them she walked through the long, brilliantly lit rooms. The Chief of Police tucked her arm under his, keeping a tight hold on her wrist. The other 5 men accompanied them. There was nothing in the general attitude to suggest that she was not a very charming woman, being escorted by a bevy of admirers. Contraras was standing by the door as the procession passed out. Agitated as she was, she saw him and flashed at him an agonized glance. He flashed back at her a glance equally eloquent. He knew the Chief of Police by sight, and he understood what had happened. Poor little Valerie had failed. They would take her to some room and search her. In her pocket they would find those cunning little bombs that, once launched, would have sent tyrants and oppressors hurling into space and proclaimed the dawn of the new era. Poor little Valerie. His eyes grew misty. As she had failed, it would have been better if he had left her alone. If ever he felt remorse in his life, he felt it that night. His first impulse was to leave the palace at once, but wiser thoughts prevailed. The Chief of Police had recognized him, he was sure. If he left immediately, it might give cause for suspicion. Valerie had failed. For the moment, the cause had suffered a setback. But his resolution was still undaunted, his brain still active. Because he had failed today, it did not follow that he would not be successful tomorrow. He sought out the Duchess del Pineda, who was, as usual, surrounded by a group of chattering friends. "Good evening, Duchess. What has become of our young friend, Mademoiselle Delmonte?" "I really cannot tell you. She broke away from me a long time ago. She has been a tremendous success, I can assure you. I hope she intends to make a long stay in Madrid. She will be most popular." "I really cannot tell you. I know nothing of her plans," answered Contraras in his grave, quiet tone. "As I told the Duke, I met her in France and England, where she appeared to move in the best circles." "Naturally," said the innocent Duchess. Nobody would suspect the highly respected Contraras of telling a deliberate lie. Outside the palace the crowd had thinned, but Moreno and Violet Hargrave still waited. Midnight had struck, and all was quiet. There were no signs that heralded the happening of a tragedy. A few belated arrivals passed through to the palace. The crowd began to melt away. And then there was a little stir. A carriage drove up outside the palace doors. 2 men and a woman stepped into it. The woman was in evening dress. The carriage passed the 2 watchers. Mrs. Hargrave peered into the slowly moving vehicle. "Valerie Delmonte," she whispered excitedly. "There is a man sitting beside her, one of those 2 men I noticed driving in. Don't you remember I said they looked people of importance, and you said you did not know them from Adam? What does it mean? Valerie alone with those men?" "It looks as if the coup had failed," replied Moreno quietly. "I should say that Valerie has been caught, and those 2 men are members of the police." Mrs. Hargrave grew a little hysterical. "Thank God it was not myself," she added after a pause. "I am glad it was not you." Moreno was about to reply when another carriage drove through, the occupant of which was Contraras. His tall form seemed huddled up. He was evidently in a state of extreme dejection. Moreno tucked Mrs. Hargrave's arm under his own. "Come along. Evidently the coup has failed. The police have been one too many for us. Valerie Delmonte going away with those 2 men. Poor old Contraras huddled up in that carriage, his attitude expressing that all is lost, at any rate for the moment. We have nothing to wait for. We shall hear all about it tomorrow." They walked along arm in arm, both occupied with their own thoughts. Mrs. Hargrave broke the long silence. "He is a wonderful man. If he is dejected tonight, he will be full of energy and vigour tomorrow." Moreno agreed. "Yes, he will think of more coups. I suppose the next one will be the removal of Mr. Rossett." Violet made no answer immediately. Then presently she said, "I fancy he is considered a rather dangerous person from our point of view." Moreno shrugged his shoulders. "And yet I fancy his removal would not greatly hasten the new era, do you? He is really a quite insignificant person. If Valerie had brought it off tonight, well and good. But I must confess these minor developments don't interest me greatly. Do they interest you?" "A little, I think," answered Mrs. Hargrave in a somewhat faint voice. Moreno looked at her steadfastly. Her nerves were a bit out of order tonight. That long vigil outside the palace had told on them. That waiting for the crash of the bombs which Valerie Delmonte had carried in her pocket, the bombs which now had been appropriated by the Chief of Police. He gave her arm a tender pressure. "I believe at bottom you are really a womanly woman. The end justifies the means, of course, But some of the means are very bloodthirsty, don't you think? I thought so tonight when I was waiting to hear the crash of those devilish cunning little bombs, the latest invention of science, as our good old Contraras assures us." Moreno pulled himself up. Perhaps he had been a little too frank. But he knew that the photographed letter always gave him the whip hand of Violet Hargrave.
"Still, we must not be squeamish."
"Revolutions are not made with rose water, and you must break eggs to make omelettes." "Absolutely true." Mrs. Hargrave, looking provokingly pretty under her veil, sighed a soft assent to these platitudes. He fancied her arm gave a responsive pressure to his. When he went to bed that night, Moreno was disturbed with remorseful thoughts of Valerie Delmonte. If the Chief of Police had found those bombs in her pocket, it was he who had told that somewhat slow-moving official he would find them there. Then he comforted himself. If he had betrayed Valerie, he had prevented her from hurling to destruction a dozen or more innocent people. His conscience was quite clear. If she had been a very ugly woman instead of a very pretty one, perhaps his conscience might not have been troubled at all. "I didn't think much of that Chief of Police at first," he murmured drowsily as he turned on his pillow. "But he seems to have managed it all right. Still, on the whole, I would rather deal with Scotland Yard or the Sûreté in Paris." End of chapter 16. Recording by Tom Weiss, Tom'sAudiobooks.com.
Chapter 17 of Whither Thou Goest by William le Queux. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Tom Weiss. Chapter 17. Lord Saxham and his daughter had left Ticehurst Park. They were in their town house in Belgrave Square. They were neither of them very fond of London. The Earl, in his youth and middle age, had experienced all the fleeting joys of the metropolis. Mary, after the experience of her unfortunate love affair, had definitely resolved that she would retire into a convent and devote herself to good works as soon as her father died. Belgrave Square was even a little duller than Ticehurst Park. They were in the midst of a crowd that had forgotten them. Lord Saxham was, to put it vulgarly, a back number, and was quite out of the modern world. Lady Mary, during her brief season, had fallen head over ears in love with the handsome young guardsman, and had buried her heart in his grave. The only thing that had drawn them up from the sylvan shades of Ticehurst Park was this: they wanted to be near Greatorex, that they could know what was happening to Guy at first hand. The eldest son of the house, Viscount Ticehurst, dropped in occasionally, and deigned to spare them a few moments of his valuable time. As a matter of fact, at the present moment, he was occupied with a particularly pretty chorus girl, whom he was half inclined to marry. Mary was fond of both her brothers, but she recognized the difference in them. Eric was as weak as water and destitute of brains. He was capable of marrying any chorus girl on the sly, and then rushing her down home and presenting her as his wife, to the terrible consternation of his poor old father, who thought that people should always marry in their own class. Guy was different. There was just a little bit of common sense in him. He had fallen violently in love with Isabel Clandon, a girl not quite in his own world, from the Earl's point of view, but a sweet and lovable girl, and above all, a lady. And Guy had waited for the parental consent, which had been wrung under somewhat false pretences. But he had been content to wait until his future wife would be received under proper auspices. He would not rush her down and take his father by storm, as Ticehurst would do when the time came for him to present his chorus girl to a justly offended parent. Father and daughter sat at luncheon in the dining room of the house in Belgrave Square. Very terribly did Lady Mary miss her beautiful gardens, her flowers, her dogs, her aviary of little songsters. She was essentially a country girl. She hated any city with its cramped and narrow streets. Even Paris had no attractions for her. Vienna and Berlin left her cold.
"You have seen Greatorex this morning, father?" she questioned when the servants had withdrawn. Lord Saxham frowned. He had realized in this his latest visit to the metropolis that he was a back number. He remembered the years long ago when he was the most golden of the gilded youth. Then his name was one to conjure with. He led the revels. If it pleased him, he painted the town red. Now, except for a few ancient cronies, nobody recognized him. "Yes, I saw Greatorex," he answered gloomily. "He was always as close as wax. He is closer than ever. He comes of an infernally close family. That family has never been anything great." He was getting into his explosive vein. "Always underlings and jackals, always content to serve." "What did he say about Guy?" asked Mary softly. "Only that he was quite happy and well. He did vouchsafe to volunteer the information that some great anarchist coup had failed." "Well, that was about as much as you could expect," said Mary in her quiet, gentle tones. "He is not going to give information to everybody." "To everybody!" spluttered the Earl in his most fiery mood. "Am I everybody? I have supported this government through thick and thin. I have backed them up through everything. Why do they withhold their confidence from me at this important moment?" Lady Mary used all her finesse. She knew too well why Greatorex did not trust him. He was an open sieve. All news would filter through him in 5 minutes, at all his clubs, to the first acquaintance he met. "You must not blame Greatorex, dear. He carries a very heavy burden. He dare not give an incautious confidence, drop a random word." "But why this reticence to me of all people?" thundered Lord Saxham in his most indignant tones. "Am I not the soul of discretion? Should I betray a confidence?" Mary made no answer. She knew her father well. Privately, he was the soul of honour. He would not betray a confidence wilfully. But he was loose of speech, and he was quite vain. He would drop a few hints, perhaps unconsciously, from which attentive listeners might gather much. She let the stormy ebullition pass. Then she spoke. "I wish we could hear some really authentic news of dear old Guy." The Earl grunted. "You hear daily from Isobel?" "Of course, but Isobel is a woman. She tells me what she is allowed to know. Because she is a woman, Guy and Moreno keep everything from her. They make out the path is strewn with roses. They will not tell her the truth for fear of frightening her." "Then where are you going to get your information from?" asked the Earl querulously. There was a long pause. When she spoke, a faint colour dyed Lady Mary's cheek. "I wonder if that young barrister would know anything. I almost forgot his name. You remember, Isobel's cousin who came down to Ticehurst and arranged her journey to Spain?" "Yes, I remember, Maurice Farquhar. He is a bosom friend of that Spanish man Moreno, who I fancy is trying his best to defeat the anarchists." The Earl was, fortunately, very unobservant today. "Yes, I remember him quite well. A perfectly decent sort of young fellow. A rather forlorn hope, eh?" The flush had died away from Mary's cheek. She had regained her self-control. She spoke quite calmly. "Yes, I agree, but drowning people catch at a straw. Let me ask him to dinner and find out if he knows anything." Lord Saxham was certainly in his most benignant mood. "By all means, he might be useful." Lady Mary wrote a note to Farquhar, addressed to his chambers in the Temple. It was a somewhat formal letter. When she put pen to paper, Mary was always formal, inviting him to dine in Belgrave Square. Farquhar's first impulse was to refuse. He had no wish to mingle with the aristocracy on unequal terms. When he became Lord Chancellor, it would be a different matter. Then he thought of Lady Mary's winsome appearance, and he altered his mind. He sent a note accepting the invitation. But of course he knew why he was being asked. They wanted to know if he could give any reliable information about Guy Rossett. He presented himself at Belgrave Square on the tick of the clock. Not for him the Mauvais Quartier consecrated to meaningless conversation in the drawing-room. Lord Saxham shook him kindly by the hand. Lady Mary was graciousness itself. Could she ever be anything but kind, even if there was, at the back, a little subtle feminine diplomacy?
It was a party of 3, waited on in solemn state by the butler and 2 footmen. There was not even a 4th to make matters even. Farquhar smiled inwardly. These 2 guileless persons, father and daughter, must have desired his company exceedingly. Well, he would learn all about it later on. The servants had withdrawn. The men smoked. Lady Mary did not leave the room. It was an informal party. Farquhar puffed leisurely at his cigar. He was awaiting developments. Saxham opened the ball. He was a most undisciplined person. He was always like a bull in a china shop, charging with blind fury. "It's about Guy. We're awfully anxious, you know," he said in his loud, resonant tones. "I wonder if you can help us at all. My daughter and Isabel tell me you are a great friend of Moreno." Beneath his somewhat pachydermatous exterior, Farquhar had a certain vein of sensitiveness. He was now sure of what he had suspected. He had been asked to dine for the purposes of being pumped for the information he could or could not give them. Lord Saxham, in his blunt, vulgar fashion, had so unsuccessfully masked his hospitality. Then he caught Lady Mary's pleading, almost shamefaced glance. "I can guess what is in your mind, Mr. Farquhar, but I beg you to forgive our anxiety. We are very pleased to see you here for your own sake. If you can help us with Guy, we shall be doubly pleased." She leaned across and said in a whisper that did not reach Lord Saxham's ears, dulled with age, "My father will, unfortunately, always take the lead, but he is not always happy in his way of expressing himself." The rather stiff-backed young lawyer forgot his momentary resentment under the kind words of this charming young woman who could so graciously pour oil on the troubled waters. "Please, Lady Mary, tell me in what way I can serve you." There was no stiffness in his tones. Lord Saxham had subsided now. He gathered in a dim sort of way that he had put his foot in it for about the 1000th time in his long career. He was going to leave it all to his capable daughter. Mary drew her chair closer to the guest. Lord Saxham for the moment was out of the picture. Besides, he was nodding over his second glass of port. It was better so, he was now incapable of mischief. Mary put her cards frankly on the table. "As I told you just now, we are very pleased to see you for yourself, as a cousin of dear Isabel. At least, I am certainly very pleased." A faint colour suffused her cheek. Farquhar bowed. No barrister can blush, but into his rather cold eyes there came a softer light which might be taken to express emotion. "Lady Mary, I am quite certain you are not a woman who would ever say anything you did not mean. Of course there was an ulterior motive," continued Mary with her usual frankness. The flush on her cheek had not quite died away. It had rather been revived by a compliment that was meant to be sincere. "There was an ulterior motive, as I have candidly admitted. We are very anxious about Guy. Greatorex will tell us nothing. My father has been to him this morning, and he keeps his mouth shut. We hear nothing from Guy, of course. He does not wish to alarm us. Isabel writes short, chatty letters. Naturally, Guy does not tell her anything. She knows no more than we do. The question is, Mr. Farquhar, do you know anything? You can easily understand how anxious we are." Farquhar smoked on steadily. It was some time before he spoke. Lord Saxham was now slumbering peacefully after his heavy dinner and his third glass of port. He looked just a little contemptuously at the somnolent figure. At Lord Saxham's age, he expected to be Lord Chancellor, alert and vigorous. When he spoke, he did not answer her question. Rather, he pursued the train of his own thoughts. "It seems to me, Lady Mary," he said, speaking very softly so that he should not disturb the slumbers of his host, "that in a measure you bear upon your shoulders, very capable shoulders I will admit, the entire burden of your family." Mary protested feebly. "Oh, no, don't think that for a moment. My father is very vigorous as a rule. Eric is quite a nice boy, just a little wild, perhaps. And Guy has got lots of grit. He will make good yet. I cannot thank Isabel enough for teaching us how cowardly we were for wanting to have him recalled." "Isabel has tons of grit," said Farquhar shortly. "She comes from a fighting line."
Yes, Isobel, as you say, has tons of grit." Lady Mary looked at him curiously. "You are very fond of your cousin, are you not, Mr. Farquhar?" "I am very fond of Isobel," said the young barrister quietly. "We were brought up as children together. I was a few years her senior. I used to carry her about as a little child." Mary looked at him again, and for a second time a faint flush dyed her faint cheek. "Will you think it very impertinent of me, Mr. Farquhar, if I suggest that you were very much in love with your pretty cousin?" Farquhar shook his head. "I don't deny it for a moment. I was very much in love with Isobel. I always wanted her for my wife, but the consideration of ways and means prevented. When I did ask her, I learned that she had accepted your brother." "And you are still in love with her?" questioned Mary a little eagerly. "It is no use being in love with a girl who is betrothed to another man. It is one of those vain dreams that a sensible man dismisses. Isobel Clandon is to me now a dear cousin, a good friend." Somehow Lady Mary looked relieved. She spoke lightly. "You will get over it, and one day you will marry. And when you are Lord Chancellor, your wife will be the first female subject in the kingdom." "And Isobel will be the wife of an ambassador," said Farquhar. "We shall run each other close, shall we not?" Mary laughed. "Oh, Guy will have stamina enough to become an ambassador. When he comes into dear old Aunt Henrietta's money, he will throw it all over and lead his pleasant old idle life. I know Guy too well." "Don't you think Isobel will put grit into him?" "Isobel is a loving woman. She will always see eye to eye with Guy. Whatever he determines, she will acquiesce in." Farquhar sighed. Ambition was always with him the dominating note. He regretted its absence in others. "A pity," he said. "With your family influence, he might go far." "He doesn't want to go far, Mr. Farquhar," she whispered. She pointed at the slumbering figure of Lord Saxham. "My father has plenty of brains. If he had worked, he might have been Prime Minister, or very near it. In the Rossett family there is a certain amount of grit, but not quite enough to bring them to the foremost place." Farquhar leaned across the table. This was certainly one of the most charming women he had ever met. "I say, Lady Mary, what a pity you are not a man. If you had been, I am sure you would have put the Rossett family in their right place." He cast a cautious glance at the still slumbering host. Lady Mary smiled pleasantly. She was not ill pleased with the genuine compliment. "Yes, perhaps, if I had been born a man. I should certainly have been better than Eric, perhaps a shade better than Guy." She broke off suddenly. "But it is idle to talk of these things. I am a woman, and must be contented with my lot, my humble sphere. Now, can you tell me anything of my brother?" "You want me to tell you the truth, and you will not be afraid to hear it?" "No, I shall not be afraid." She spoke very bravely, but he noticed that her hands were trembling. "I had a letter from Moreno this morning. He tells me that the design against your brother has temporarily dropped into abeyance. They had a very great coup on, that has failed. He has reason to suspect that they will now turn their attention to Mr. Rossett." The tears coursed slowly down Mary's face. The Earl slumbered on peacefully. Then she raised her head. Her eyes flashed. She looked angrily at her sleeping father. "Oh, our poor Guy! And it is his fault." She pointed at the somnolent Earl. "His fault entirely. He wanted to separate him from Isobel, because he thought she was not good enough for him. He went to Greatorex, and with his influence he got this post at Madrid, and he has sent him to his death." Farquhar felt very sympathetic. No man can very properly appreciate his successful rival. But he was forced to admit that there was something in Guy Rossett that appealed alike to men and women. "Now listen, Lady Mary. Moreno tells me a lot, because to a certain extent I have been in it from the beginning. I won't bore you with details. Anyway, Moreno says he is quite certain he can save your brother. Perhaps Moreno may be a little too cocksure. He is a very vain sort of fellow. He goes so far as to hint that he might require my assistance." Mary looked puzzled. "Your assistance? But where do you come in this awful mix-up?" "It is perhaps a little difficult to explain. It was one of the few occasions in his life on which the self-possessed young barrister had felt embarrassed. "It is, perhaps, a little difficult to explain," he repeated. "Moreno and I are very old friends. He was one night in my chambers. He extracted a promise from me that if he called upon me, I would help your brother." Mary shot at him a swift and penetrating glance. "I can understand, Mr. Farquhar, that you and Mr. Moreno are old friends, that you owe many a good turn to one another. But my brother is nothing to you. Why should you put yourself out of the way for him?" Farquhar temporized. "One sometimes gives promises rather rashly, Lady Mary." There was a long pause before the woman spoke. "I think I can understand," she said. "You gave that promise not because you cared for my brother, but because you wanted to help Isobel Clandon." Farquhar did not beat about the bush. "Yes, I wanted to help Isobel. Naturally, I do not love your brother, but she loves him, and her happiness is my first consideration." Mary looked at him with her soft, kindly eyes. "I think of all the lovers I have heard or read of, you are the truest," she said, "and also the kindliest. If our positions had been reversed, I rather doubt if I could have done that." But Farquhar shook his head. "Oh, you are one of God's good women. In any situation you would act 1,000 times better than I should." Suddenly the somnolent Earl woke up, in full possession of his faculties. "Well, Farquhar, what do you know about Guy?" He took the matter up from the point where it had been left in abeyance. Farquhar explained patiently that, in his opinion, Guy Rossett was in a position of considerable danger. Naturally, at this point, Lord Saxham went off at a violent tangent. "Then why the devil doesn't Greatorex recall him, as I have begged him to do? Good heavens! I have been supporting this wretched government through thick and thin. Can't they grant me this little favour? My poor boy! He doesn't want their infernal promotion. He will inherit a big fortune from his great aunt. He can snap his fingers at Greatorex and the rest of them." Suddenly he began to sob, and buried his head in his hands. "My poor murdered boy," he moaned, "and Greatorex sent him to his death." Farquhar smoked on stolidly. He did not feel greatly attracted towards his host. Lady Mary shot a somewhat contemptuous glance at her penitent parent, who was seeking to throw the blame on Greatorex. "Pay no attention to him," she whispered across the table. "The Foreign Office is not to blame. He got Guy transferred abroad in order to separate him from Isobel. I have told you." Farquhar understood and nodded. He had already come to the conclusion that Lord Saxham was a very poor and weak creature, not a good specimen of his order. How had he become possessed of such a daughter, so gentle, so high-minded? There must have been some virility on the female side of the family. He drove back to his chambers in a rather exhilarated frame of mind. Lady Mary was very charming. He had quite got over that first feeling that he was to be exploited for the benefit of the Rossett family. Mary had put that all right in her gentle, persuasive way. She had expressly laid emphasis on the fact that she, at any rate, was pleased to welcome him for himself. He dismissed his taxi and climbed up the steep stairs to his suite of rooms in one of the most cloistered courts of the Temple. To his surprise, the light in the hall was burning. What had happened? He went into the dining room, a blaze of electric light. Stretched on the sofa, puffing at a long cigar, was Andreas Moreno, awaiting his arrival. "The devil!" cried Farquhar shortly, sharply, and decisively. Moreno waved a genial hand. "Not exactly, old man, but one of his ambassadors. I say, I suppose you can give me a shakedown?" "Of course, but why are you here? Why are you not in Spain?" "All will be unfolded in good time, my boy. But what a drink! I could do with one." "You know where the things are. Surely you could have helped yourself," said Farquhar. "Never care to drink alone, old man. By the way, I see you are in evening togs. Have you been dining with the aristocracy?" "You've just hit it," replied Farquhar, as he went to the sideboard and fetched out a decanter of whisky. "I have been dining in Belgrave Square with the Earl of Saxham and his daughter, Lady Mary Rossett." "Good heavens! This might be called a coincidence," cried Moreno,
as he drained the refreshing draught offered to him.
Farquhar was rather impatient at any exhibition of humour. He frowned a little. "Now, Moreno, out with it. What has brought you here? I am delighted to see you, of course, but you have not come all this long journey for nothing." But Moreno was still in high spirits that were not to be abruptly quenched. "What a splendid Lord Chancellor you will make, always with both eyes on the practical, intolerant of anything that disturbs the even course of justice, perfect embodiment of the legal mind. A votre santé, mon ami." He drained his glass. Farquhar looked at him critically. "You are a bit of an ass tonight, aren't you?" "Not at all, most noble Festus. Never was I saner than I am at the present hour. Well, perhaps just at the moment I am suffering a little from swollen head. I, the poor Fleet Street journalist, you remember, Farquhar, how they used to despise me in the early days, have outwitted the keenest brains of the anarchists. I have made abortive their great coup." "I know," said Farquhar generously. "My hearty congratulations, old man. But still you have not come all this way to tell me that. You have something behind." Moreno's manner changed at once. He sat down in an easy-chair, and became the solemn and grave personage who had important interests at stake. "You remember an interview in these chambers a little time ago, when you gave me a certain promise?" Farquhar remembered the incident well. "Yes, I gave you a certain promise. You have come to remind me of it? Are you overwhelmed with briefs?" "I cannot exactly say I am overwhelmed with them, but I have enough to keep me going." "I see," said Moreno quietly. He had cast aside his gay and chaffing mood. He was quite serious. "Can you depute those to somebody?" "If it were imperative, I could." Moreno rose and laid his hand on his friend's shoulder. "Good. Then I claim your promise. Pack your bag tomorrow morning and come with me to Spain. I am going to outwit them again. I might do it single-handed, but your assistance will be invaluable. Will you come?" "It is to help Guy Rossett?" "It is to help Isobel Clandon through Guy Rossett. I will explain everything as we travel together tomorrow." "I adhere to my promise," said Farquhar. "I will make all my arrangements in the morning. I shall be at your disposal after 12. How long will you want me for?" "A week at the outside." Moreno stifled a yawn. In spite of his vigorous constitution, he was very tired. "Let us turn in, old man. I feel as if I could sleep the clock round." Chapter 17. Recording by Tom Weiss, Tom'sAudiobooks.com. Chapter 18 of Whither Thou Goest by William le Queux. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Tom Weiss. Chapter 18. Contraras paid a flying visit to London. It was a secret visit, that is to say, he stayed in an obscure hotel in the east of London, not venturing to his house in Fitzjohn's Avenue. His wife and daughter believed him to be still in Spain, from where he wrote letters to them at irregular intervals. He was far too busy to attend closely to domestic correspondence. Moreover, like many great reformers, he had little in common with his family. His wife openly sneered at his doctrines. Privately she thought he was a hypocrite who lacked the courage to practice what he preached, to lead the simple life which he was inculcating upon others. Their only child fully endorsed the mother's sentiments. Moreover, she was in love with a young man who had been attracted to her by the report of her father's wealth. He was a poor cadet of an old and aristocratic family, and conservative to the backbone. The slightest word of this somewhat empty-headed young man outweighed the most profound arguments of the intellectual Contraras. She was very dissatisfied with her parent, with what she considered his nonsensical theories of perfect equality. Miss Contraras was quite content to take the world as she found it. She did not trouble her head about the woes of the humbler classes. As long as she could live softly and have plenty of new frocks, she was happy. Why should people with brains trouble to keep those who could not keep themselves? Contraras came over to be present at the special meeting of the English section of the Brotherhood, held as usual at Makeda's restaurant. The great coup had failed, but he was still undaunted, still full of resolution. There were only about half a dozen choice spirits present. Makeda, for this special occasion, had delegated to his manager the task of looking after his comfortable little establishment. Both Lucue and the restaurant keeper greeted their chief with a sorrowful air. Makeda voiced their mutual sentiments. "The iron must have entered into your soul, comrade. So near to success, and then to fail. And then the fate of poor Valerie, so bright, so clever, so full of enthusiasm for the cause." The leader's voice broke a little as he answered. "Alas, poor Valerie, a fate worse than death. How she will eat out that brave heart of hers in their loathsome dungeons." He passed his hand across his brow, as if in that action he was trying to brush away a painful reminiscence. But the next moment he was again the man of action, of indomitable resolve. "I think never again will I sanction the use of women in enterprises of this character, however willing they may be to take the risk and pay the penalty of failure. And now to our immediate business. How are things progressing in this country?" Both Lucue and Makeda, but especially the former, who had only the business of the propaganda to attend to, gave him a most encouraging report. There was great dissatisfaction amongst the masses, a growing hatred of the class that neither toils nor spins. Many of the most influential leaders were in secret sympathy with their doctrines, and only waited for a favourable moment to come out into the open. The fanatical Contraras rubbed his hands, his brow cleared. He had forgotten Valerie Delmonte, that too responsive instrument upon whose warped feelings he had so skilfully played. She was only a martyr in a righteous cause. He listened eagerly to the details with which Lucue supplied him. He could see already the dawn of that universal revolution which, if it came to pass, would claim him for one of the earliest victims. And then, when Lucue had finished, the elder man spoke a little impatiently. "But why did we fail in Madrid? Have you suspicions of anybody? After all, the secret was very carefully guarded. How many of us knew?" Lucue shrugged his shoulders. "Is it much use going into that? We might all suspect each other. Moreno was over here a short time ago. We conversed together on the subject." "Ah, Moreno was over here, was he?" The chief's brows knitted. He spoke in a suspicious voice. "Do you know on what business? Purely private matters, I understand. Something connected with his journalistic profession. But we were discussing the matter, and he suggested a very reasonable theory." "And what was that?" interrupted Contraras. "His opinion was, to start with, that women should never be employed in enterprises of this character, because they had not sufficient nerve. His theory is that there was no treachery from our side, because if there had been, they would never have allowed her to get inside the palace. They would have arrested her at the entrance." "It seems feasible," interrupted the chief. "He thinks that Valerie got nervous and overstrung, that she detached herself too early from her chaperone, that the numerous spies who were watching got suspicious of her movements, and arrested her on the off chance." Contraras nodded his head as he added, "It might be so, and it is quite true that women lose their heads more quickly than men when things are not running exactly in the beaten track. Of course, as you may or may not know, our friend Moreno, although a very excellent fellow, is one of the vainest of men. He boasted that if you had given him the job, he would have done it successfully, and I have sufficient faith in him to believe he would." Lucue spoke quite warmly. It was not a little to the journalist's credit that he had succeeded in persuading this rather suspicious man both of his ability and his bona fides. Contraras reflected for a few moments. "I have great confidence in your judgment, Lucue. You have known this man for a long time, eh?" "For 6 or 7 years, I should say." It was perfectly true. Moreno had been coquetting with Lucue and the Brotherhood, and half a dozen other things, for quite a period. "And you trust him implicitly? He is making much money?" "A little more than he used, but he tells me he is miserably paid, that the capitalists he works for suck his brains to swell their own enormous profits." Contraras smiled. "He has brains and he is poorly paid. In a word, he enriches the drones. He seems just our man, Lucue." "I am sure of it," answered the other warmly. "Good. I shall be seeing him in Madrid very shortly. We will try his mettle. He shall have the management of the next coup." "And that, I take it, is the removal of that busy marplot, Guy Rossett?" "Yes," said Contraras shortly. "But keep it to yourself and Maceda as much as possible. I won't have too many people in the know this time." Lucue and Maceda promised to observe silence. The other members of the fraternity had drawn respectfully aside while the three chiefs conversed together. Jacques, otherwise Mr. Jackson, arrived presently, and was informed of the conversation. He was always to be trusted. He was as great an enthusiast as Contraras himself. "How is my little Violet getting on?" he asked. "So far she has done good quiet work," was the chief's answer. "Of course she never had the grit of poor Valerie, nor, I think, the enthusiasm." "Possibly, possibly," agreed Jacques, who was very fond of his pretty protege. "But still, if she is a bit slow, she is certainly very sure. And although we must all make sacrifices in the great cause when we are called upon, I am glad to think she is not in the position of poor Valerie. Ah, what a fate!" The cunning old rogue, who was making money hand over fist, sighed in real or pretended sorrow for the unhappy young Frenchwoman whose ardent sympathies had landed her in such a plight. Jacques had given plenty of money to the cause, but like Contraras, he had never greatly risked his precious skin. The next day Contraras returned to Madrid. He could safely leave Jacques and Lucue to look after affairs in England. After the failure of the great coup, there had been a little reshuffling. Somoza, the educated young fisherman, a burning and shining light in the brotherhood, and Alvedero were stationed at Fuenterrabia. Zorrilta was superintending affairs at Barcelona. Contraras, the wealthy and magnificent, still maintained his headquarters in the palatial hotel in the Plaza de Canovas. Moreno and Violet Hargrave were in Madrid also, but they had lodgings in a humbler quarter of the city. Moreno often smiled when he thought what humbug it all was, this profession of democracy and equality. Because they were, comparatively speaking, humble members of the brotherhood, they were stowed away in poky lodgings. Contraras had a suite of rooms at the best hotel in the city, and went occasionally to court. What a gigantic farce, he thought. As if you could alter the primeval instincts of human nature by a carefully adjusted system of labels. And as for tyranny and oppression, if I were a Spanish citizen, I would rather live under the rule of Alfonso than that of Contraras. If the old man got into the saddle, there would be plenty of shooting. He would make short work of those who didn't agree with him without the formality of a trial. Contraras was a wary old schemer. He had many visitors at his hotel, men of light and leading in the city, the aristocratic connections of his wife. But he never allowed his anarchist subordinates to come near him. He was much too clever for that. He went to them. On the evening of the day on which he returned to Madrid, he met Moreno and Violet Hargrave at the journalist's modest lodgings by appointment. Moreno, who was always fond of indulging in humorous jokes, would have liked to apologize to the wealthy Contraras for receiving him in such humble surroundings, with some caustic allusion to the time when all men would be equal. But he forbore. Contraras was too serious a person to indulge in humour himself, or tolerate it in others. Besides, Moreno had special reasons for ingratiating himself with his chief, whom he privately stigmatized as a silly old visionary, and whose chances against the organized forces of law and order he was not prepared to back. Contraras was very gracious to his two subordinates. Whatever his defects, he had the true note of Spanish courtesy. He turned first to Violet Hargrave. "I have just come from London, where I met our dear friend Jacques. He inquired most tenderly after you, and sent through me his kindest remembrances." Violet looked very pleased. If there was a tender spot in her heart, it was for the old moneylender who had been a father to her. She flushed a little, quite a soft light came into her eyes. "That was very sweet of him. He really has a heart of gold, dear old Juan," she said softly. Moreno looked at her curiously. He had not got to the bottom of her yet. A hardened adventuress, pure and simple, that was how he had first judged her. But her kindly mention of Jacques, an old shark of the first water, as the young journalist classed him in his own mind, revealed something that he had not credited her with. Had she, after all, a capacity for emotion? Did she possess any real womanly instincts? Contraras next addressed himself to Moreno. "I also met in London our comrade Lucue, the man who introduced you to the Brotherhood." "Ah, what a great man!" cried Moreno, with the fervour of a new and enthusiastic recruit. "The only man, in my opinion, who would ever be worthy to wear your mantle if ever it should drop from your shoulders. May that day be far distant," he added piously. Contraras, ever pleased with a little judicious flattery, became more amiable than ever. The glance he bent upon the young journalist was almost a benevolent one. "Lucue speaks very highly of you, and I have always had the greatest confidence in his judgment. He tells me, and as he did not say it in confidence, I can repeat it, you expressed your opinion that we made a mistake in allowing Valerie to undertake the great coup. You added that if you had been entrusted with it, you would have brought it off." The question was a supreme test of Moreno's modesty, but he was not taken aback. He turned the situation lightly, and with his usual assurance. "I am certain I should have done," he said composedly. Contraras frowned a little. He had been very fond of Valerie Delmonte. He rather resented any criticism of her. "Why are you so sure, Comrade Moreno? Valerie was very clever, very subtle." "Are you more so?" The young man looked at his chief calmly. "I dare say she was much more clever, much more subtle than I am, but she lacked my nerve." "Ah, there is something in that," agreed the older man. "A woman may have the brains of a man, I agree, that is to say, an exceptional woman, but come to a crucial moment and the brain will be dominated by the nerves. It is the penalty of the sex." The chief ruminated over these remarks a few seconds before he spoke again. "Well, Moreno, I am going to give you a chance to prove your mettle. You know the next item on our programme is the removal of Guy Rossett." Moreno nodded. He had shot a side glance at Violet Hargrave, but she had betrayed no sign of emotion. And yet, in the flat at Mount Street, she had alluded to the project in a spirit of exultation. "It was the first item on the programme, and was shelved in favour of the latter one. What do you mean precisely by the term removal?" Contraras shrugged his shoulders. "That I have not yet quite decided upon. The first thing is to get hold of him." "That is quite easy," said Moreno in his usual quiet way. Contraras looked at him sharply. "You speak very confidently, Moreno. You appreciate the difficulties in the way? To get him either out of the Embassy or his flat will be a tough job. He is well guarded, you may depend." "I appreciate all the difficulties, Contraras. To get him out of the Embassy is well nigh impossible. To get him out of the flat is the easier job of the two. Well, I will undertake to bring him to any place you like." "Your methods?" queried Contraras in the same sharp tone. Moreno bowed with great courtesy to his titular chief. "Pardon me for declining to answer that question at present. I am a very new member of the Brotherhood. I have my spurs to win. I have to justify your confidence in me, or I should rather say the confidence of Lucue, for you know next to nothing of me. I want to show you that I am a little more clever, a little more subtle than perhaps you imagine. When I deliver him to you, I will possibly explain my methods, not before." "You will undertake to deliver him to us?" questioned Contraras, still speaking a little doubtfully. He was, however, very much impressed by the young man's confident manner. "On any day, at any hour you like to name," was the assuring reply. "I will settle the details later on," said Contraras, his voice betraying a note of agitation. "Anyway, I depute you and Violet Hargrave to see that this thing is carried out." Moreno looked at the woman. "You will be my assistant in this?" he asked. Her voice was very low. "Of course, if the Chief wishes it." Contraras spoke in his most authoritative tones. "You have no choice. You took a solemn oath to obey the orders of the chiefs of the organisation. As your chief, I call upon you to do this." Violet Hargrave bowed her head submissively. She remembered there was a terrible penalty attached to hesitation or disobedience. She also recalled the fate of Valerie Delmonte, and her face went white. Moreno thought to himself, "Infernal old scoundrel, he doesn't care whom he sacrifices. And in the meanwhile he is living in luxury and getting us poor devils to run all the risk." Aloud he said, "And what will you do with Guy Rossett when I deliver him to you?" Contraras reflected before he spoke. "As I told you just now, I have not quite made up my mind." He paused and struck an imposing attitude. "You know, Moreno, it has always been my policy to strike at the head and heart of this effete system. The humbler members, mere tools of their superiors, well, I have been inclined to show them mercy." "I know that has always been your generous inclination," replied Moreno, masking his loathing of this fanatical creature. "Well, I should say Rossett was quite a tool, very poor game." "I am inclined to agree with you. Still he is active and dangerous, and a menace to the cause. He knows too much about many of us." Quite true," said Moreno. He had an object in humouring this venerable visionary. He wanted to know what was at the back of his mind, what dark scheme he was working out in his subtle brain. Contraras spoke in a meditative voice. "These Englishmen are strange people. They have a great respect for their word." "It is one of their peculiarities," admitted Moreno dryly. "If he would take a solemn oath to resign his post, and withdraw himself from any further opposition to the Brotherhood, I think I would accept that and let him go free." "And that, I am afraid, is just the thing you will never induce an Englishman to do," said Moreno bluntly. "I know the type too well. Better death than dishonour, all that sort of thing, you know. It's in their blood." Contraras smiled oddly. "In that case, I think there is only one course. It is regrettable, it is repugnant to me, but the safety of the Brotherhood is my first consideration." Moreno had learned all he wanted to know. He knew now what was working in that fanatical brain. "I understand," he said quietly. He added with the most apparent sincerity, "The safety of the Brotherhood must always be the first thought. I quite agree." Shortly after, Contraras left to return to his luxurious hotel. He parted with the two with many expressions of good will. He was disposed to confirm Lucue's high opinion of Moreno. There was a confident bearing about the young man that impressed him. He was sure that he would prove a valuable recruit to the Brotherhood. They were left alone. The man quite young, the woman still comparatively youthful. Moreno spoke first. "We have been assigned a post of honour, but it is also a post of danger. Don't you think so?" Mrs. Hargrave shuddered. "When I remember poor Valerie Delmonte, I must confess I don't feel very brave. But you spoke very confidently of being able to snare Rossett." "I am quite confident of being able to do that." "I suppose you won't tell me why you are so confident of the fact?" Moreno shook his head. "No, I certainly won't. In this business, never let your left hand know what your right hand doeth." She shot at him a rather coquettish glance, which thrilled him just a little. She was certainly a very pretty and fascinating woman. "I am to be trusted, really, you know," she pleaded. "I can be as close as wax." "I will tell you some day," he answered. He thought, as he spoke, the day might be a very long one. "But you will tell Contraras and everybody then," she pouted. "I thought we had been such pals." It suddenly dawned upon him that this adventuress, as he had always looked upon her, was falling in love with him. He was not quite certain that he was not falling in love a little bit with her. If he were only certain that in her were the makings of a good woman. But he would require great proofs of that. He broke a rather embarrassed silence. "Well, now you will get your revenge on Guy Rossett." "I am not quite so certain that I want it now." She spoke in a very low voice. "But this is a very different mood from that of a certain night in Mount Street." I know," Violet spoke a little wildly. "I was bitter then. Things seemed changed somehow." "You know that Guy Rossett has to be removed, in obedience to the orders of a revered chief?" I know." Suddenly she burst into bitter sobbing. Presently she lifted her tear-stained face. "You think I am a very bad woman, don't you? I am not really, only hardened and embittered with my early life. If I could only find somebody who really cared for me." It was a clear invitation. Moreno took her hand in his. He could not disguise from himself that he was attracted, but at the same time he did not lose his head. Could he trust her? Would she be useful for his purpose? "Suppose that I said I cared?" Valerie sobbed afresh. "No, no, it is impossible. You would never believe in me. You could never trust me." And then Moreno leaned forward and spoke to her very gravely. "I think before you leave we must have a little conversation together. When it is finished, I will tell you whether I trust you or not." End of chapter 18. Recording by Tom Weiss, tomsaudiobooks.com. Chapter 19 of Whither Thou Goest by William le Queux. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Tom Weiss. Chapter 19. It was a long time before Moreno spoke. It was evident that, in her present mood, Violet Hargrave was perfectly prepared to be made love to. It was not the first time it had occurred to him that this woman of mixed nationality, like himself, was more than usually attracted by him. But although he was one of the vainest men living in certain respects, notably in the high estimate in which he always held his own capacity and mental qualities, still in other matters he was fairly modest. Every man can get some woman to fall in love with him, or at any rate to profess affection. Some day he would come across a woman whom he could impress sufficiently to justify him in asking her to marry him. For the time would come when, like other men, even of the most roving disposition, he would want to say good-bye to adventure and settle down quietly. As regards his personal appearance, he was quite a just and dispassionate critic. He could look in the glass and sum up the general verdict that would be passed by the opposite sex. In appearance he was rather short and squat. His features, somewhat irregular, were redeemed from plainness by a pair of very brilliant dark eyes, and a perfect set of strong white teeth. Still, he had not the markings of a Don Juan in him. He was not the sort of man whose path was likely to be strewn with conquest, not the type of man like Guy Rossett, for instance, on whom most women looked with a kindly eye, even on their first acquaintance. Under ordinary circumstances, Violet's attitude could hardly be misinterpreted. The misty eyes raised appealingly to his, the soft inflections in her voice said as plainly as words could speak that here was a woman fully ready to respond at the first hint from him. But he was very cautious. He felt he must proceed warily. He must never forget that this woman had been, more or less, an adventuress from her girlhood, the associate of desperate and callous men, who hesitated at nothing in the attainment of their objects. Not so very long ago she had exulted in the prospect of obtaining a terrible revenge through others on the man she had once professed to love. Why had she turned, so suddenly as it seemed, from this vengeance, had almost said that she no longer desired revenge? In an ordinary woman, the explanation would have been simple. Rossett now no longer aroused her love or hate because she had found a new lover in Moreno himself. Always severe to himself in these purely personal matters, he asked himself the candid question if a woman so attractive as she undoubtedly was could turn from a man of Rossett's physical advantages to himself. Years ago he had loved devotedly a simple little girl with no pretensions to beauty or great charm, possessing only average intelligence. He had loved her for her sweet nature, her good qualities, and she had loved him in return. But this was an entirely different matter. That poor little dead girl, still a very tender memory, had never had any other lover but himself. Violet Hargrave, with her powers of fascination, her blonde prettiness, her quick mentality, must have had many men at her feet. Did the foreign element in him attract the foreign element in her? It might be so, but he could not be sure of that. In many things he was more Spanish in thought and feeling than English, but she was more English than Spanish in everything, of that he was convinced. Had he been a few years younger, had he enjoyed less experience in life, had thought less over social problems, anarchist doctrines might have appealed to him very strongly. He was sure they would never appeal to her. The English strain in her was too strong. When he spoke, he put a very leading question. "I have often wondered whether you are really greatly interested in the cause, whether the methods we have to adopt are not somewhat repugnant to you." He looked at her very steadfastly. He judged her to be an admirable actress, but he noticed she did not meet his glance. Perhaps if she was really attracted by him as she seemed to be, it was not so easy to act. She spoke a little nervously. "What on earth has made you think that? Why should I be here if I were not sincere? I joined the organization of my own free will. Juan Jacques, who was my sponsor, explained everything very clearly to me." Moreno spoke lightly. "You have been comfortably off for many years, and you are more English than foreign. Anarchist principles don't take deep root in English soil." "My father was a revolutionary at heart, although not an active one," she said hastily. "Of course, I don't suppose my mother thought about such things." Moreno was too polite to say he did not believe in that little fiction about her father. This derelict parent might not have had a very great love for the social institutions from which he did not derive much benefit, but from a natural dissatisfaction with his own lot to professed anarchy was a long step. "It runs in the blood naturally, then, that I can understand. Still, it puzzles me. Women don't think very seriously about these matters, or, at any rate, only a very few of them. And women of means are hardly likely to be keen on upsetting a world in which they are fairly comfortable, in favour of a new dispensation, the results of which are highly problematical." She fenced with him a little longer. "Why are you so sure I was comfortably off?" she queried. "I think you must have forgotten what you told me. Your husband made money through the good offices of Jacques, and that money became yours. That flat in Mount Street was not run on a small income." Then she became a little agitated under his rather ruthless cross-examination and suggestions. "That money that was left me was not enough to support me comfortably. I had to turn to other means of support." "You would not care to tell me what they were?" Of course, he had heard rumours about that Mount Street establishment, that the host and hostess were suspiciously lucky at cards. The man, at any rate, had always suffered from a shady reputation. She became more agitated. "Yes, it is quite simple. I have been well paid for my services by Jacques." "Then it was simply money that induced you to join the Brotherhood?" "Money, combined with my natural sympathy with their objects." Moreno appeared to accept the explanation. Jacques seemed then to have paid her handsomely for her services. But evidently he had not paid her enough, or she would not have trafficked with Guy Rossett and sold him important secrets. It was some little time before he spoke again, and then he played his trump card. He left the personal question altogether, and spoke of the affairs of the Brotherhood. "There must be traitors amongst us," he said presently, "although I do not think they are to be found in Spain. So many things have leaked out." "Yes," she spoke very quickly. "There was the failure of poor Valerie Delmonte. Do you think there was treachery there?" "I rather doubt it," answered Moreno easily. "My theory has always been that she drew suspicion on herself by her inexperience, her amateurish methods, her suspicious movements when she got inside the palace. If the job had been entrusted to me, with my steady nerves, I think I should have been successful. I boasted as much to Contraras, and I suppose that is the reason he has given me this job." Violet was silent. Moreno went on smoothly. "But with regard to that affair of Guy Rossett, the information he got which, for the moment, frustrated our plans, that was clearly the work of a traitor. That happened just before I came on the scene, but Lucue has told me all about it." He was looking at her very steadfastly. She was trying to avoid his gaze, but those dark, brilliant eyes of his drew her lighter ones with a certain mesmeric power. She was not acting well tonight, he thought. There crept into her troubled glance a shadow of fear. She tried to speak lightly, indifferently, but her voice broke and faltered in spite of her efforts at self-control. "It seems like it. Have you any idea of who the traitor was?" Moreno rose and walked over to the little shabby sofa, typical furniture of the mean lodgings where she sat. He flung at her the direct challenge. "It is not a question of having an idea. I know." She laughed hysterically. She hardly knew what she was saying. "You think you know, perhaps. Probably you have been led to suspect the wrong person." "Not when I have seen the actual memoranda. Not when I have a photograph of that memoranda in my possession to show, if necessary, to Contraras." For a moment she seemed paralyzed. All the colour left her cheeks. She could only clasp her hands together and moan piteously. Moreno spoke quite gently. "Violet Hargrave, you haven't an ounce of fight left in you. Give in and own you sold those secrets to Guy Rossett. I expect he paid a handsome sum for them, and probably because you sold them, you lost your lover." She burst into a fit of wild sobbing and threw herself at his feet. She had not the heroic spirit of Valerie Delmonte. She was only a very commonplace adventuress, with a well-defined streak of cowardice in her. Like Madame du Barry, she would have gone shrieking to her death. "Are you going to denounce me?" she cried wildly. Moreno was a kind-hearted man. To an extent he despised her, although he was half in love with her. But he could not but feel pitiful at the spectacle of her abject terror. "That depends," he said quietly. "It is quite possible we may drive a bargain." Reassured by those conciliatory words, the woman speedily recovered her self-control. She rose from her kneeling attitude, brushed the tears from her eyes, adjusted her disordered hair. As long as she escaped with her life, she would consent to any bargain. What a mercy she had not been found out by Contraras or some equally implacable and fanatical member of the Brotherhood. In that case her shrift would have been very short. This black-browed young man, born of a Spanish father and an English mother, had this much of the English strain in him, that he leaned to the side of mercy. "How did you find out? How did you suspect?" were her first words when she had recovered herself. "What first led me to suspect, I cannot quite explain. It was a sort of intuition. When I once suspected, the rest was easy." "It was Guy Rossett who gave me away?" she cried, and an angry gleam came into her eyes. Moreno looked at her a little contemptuously. "And you have known this man well, and loved him. Are you not a shrewder judge of human nature than to harbour such a suspicion? Why, Rossett is just that dogged type of Englishman who would rather be put to death than betray a confidence." Violet looked a little ashamed. "But if not from him, how did you obtain your information?" "That is my affair. When I have quite assured myself that I can trust you, I may tell you. It suffices that I hold in my possession the photograph of that document. By the way, you lost your head when you gave yourself away like that, because your handwriting is known to several. Why did you not dictate your notes to Rossett and let him take them down? Then you might never have been found out." "I know, I was a fool," answered Mrs. Hargrave bitterly. "I suppose all criminals make mistakes at times. I was terribly hard up at the time. I was in desperate want of money. I pitched a plausible tale to Guy, which I believe he swallowed at the time." "Ah," said Moreno. Then it was not on account of this transaction that Rossett had broken off his relations with the pretty widow. The cause was no doubt to be sought in Isabel Clandon. "I pretended that a Spaniard whom I had known in my youth was ready to turn traitor for a handsome consideration. He had confided these notes to me, and I had taken them down from his dictation. Of course, I ought to have done as you said. I was so eager for the money that I did not stop to think." "And you are quite sure that Rossett did not suspect you of being a member of the Brotherhood?" "Positive. He is not naturally a suspicious man, not like yourself, for instance. I pretended that this man, the imaginary man, was an old friend of my father's, that he hated the whole business and wanted to get out of it." Moreno pondered a little. In spite of her physical attraction for him, she was a pretty bad character on her own admissions. She had owned her great obligations to Jacques, who, rascal that he was, had been her benefactor. And yet she was ready to sell Jacques and the cause he held so dear at heart for ready money. Was it possible a woman with this unscrupulous and predatory temperament could ever become a reformed character? And if so, was he a likely man to bring about the miracle? Passionate love might work wonders, But was she not a little past the age of passionate love? "Let us come to the point," he said abruptly. "I take it you no longer desire what we politely term the removal of Guy Rossett." "Certainly not. I don't know that I ever really desired it." Moreno raised his hand. "Don't forget that night at the flat in Mount Street." "I know. I remember perfectly. I gave you a very bad impression of myself. I was angry, humiliated, bitterly jealous of a younger woman who had taken him from me." Moreno thought he understood. "And the Spanish side came uppermost then. You could have run a dagger into the pair of them at the moment, and perhaps after you had done it, sat down and wept because you had killed the man. I don't suppose you would have shed a tear over the woman. She would have deserved her fate." Violet was recovering herself fast. The colour had come back into her cheeks. She looked at him admiringly. "You seem to know something of my delightful sex," she said, with a faint smile. Then, after a pause, she added, "And you want to drive a bargain with me, don't you, in return for not denouncing me?" Moreno assented. "You are quite right. You say now you don't desire the removal of Rossett. To be quite frank, no more do I." She looked at him sharply out of her tear-dimmed eyes, red and swollen with the violent weeping of a few seconds ago. "But why do you wish to spare Guy Rossett? You say you are a true son of the Revolution." "I am," replied Moreno composedly. "I am, with certain reservations." He felt he could not trust her too implicitly yet. "When they attack the heads, the great ones of the earth, I am in the heartiest sympathy with them. That is the way to obtain our ends. But I draw the line at making martyrs of the small fry, the mere instruments, the humble tools of the despotic system. I think it brings justly deserved odium on us. To remove an inoffensive person like Rossett is worse than a crime. It is a blunder. If the great revolution is coming, how can a feeble person like him stop its impetuous course?" Violet Hargrave listened attentively. When was he going to suggest the terms of the bargain? "Will you help me to save young Rossett? It is the price of my silence. You can do nothing against me. Whatever innuendos or suggestions you might make, if such occur to you, would not weigh a moment against the damning evidence in my possession. They would only regard it as the frantic action of a guilty woman trying to save herself from their vengeance." He thought it wise to rub this in. He did not believe she was very clever, but she was cunning. He wanted to divert her from any idea of attempting to readjust the situation to her own advantage. "You show me very plainly you don't trust me by that somewhat unnecessary warning," she said a little bitterly. She was hardened enough, heaven knows, but the distrust of the man she had grown to care for hurt her more than she liked to admit. "I am not quite a fool," she added. "You have the whip hand of me, I admit frankly. If I thought to match myself against you and bluff it out, I recognise I have not a dog's chance. Yes, I am willing to help you save Guy Rossett, but I would like you to tell me why you want so particularly to save him." But Moreno was not going to satisfy her curiosity. He gave her one of his reasons. "Because I hate and loathe unnecessary bloodshed," was his answer. There was a long pause, during which Violet's mind worked rapidly. "Are you very sure in your own mind how you are going to save him?" she asked presently. "I mean, so that we can go scot-free." Self would always be the predominating note, he thought. Well, perhaps that was natural. He tapped his forehead significantly. "I have pretty well worked it out here. There are just a few details to be filled in. With regard to our own personal safety, I feel pretty confident I shall be unsuspected. As for you, I will guarantee it. I will see you every day as my plans develop." Violet rose to say good night. There was genuine admiration in her glance as she held out her hand. "I believe you are a very wonderful man," she said in a tone of conviction. Moreno smiled, well pleased with the delicate flattery. He always had a kindly feeling towards anybody who praised his mental qualities. He saw her to the door. As they parted, she lifted up her face. "You would not care to kiss a woman of my type, bad, selfish, and unscrupulous as you know me to be?" she said boldly. For a second he hesitated. Then he kissed her lightly on her pale cheek. He could not bring himself yet to touch her lips. "Anyway, you are going to do a good thing now," he said, as she passed out. End of chapter 19. Recording by Tom Weiss, tomsaudioBooks.com.
Chapter 20 of Whither Thou Goest by William le Queux. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Tom Weiss. Chapter 20. During these long, hot summer days, poor Isobel lived in alternate fits of hope and despair. Guy visited her every day. He always seemed very cheerful, full of optimism. The forces of law and order must prevail. These mad anarchists, well organized as they were, and led by a most subtle brain, would be defeated very shortly. Once the heads were taken, the movement would suffer a speedy eclipse. But at times it seemed to her quick woman's ears that there was a false note in his cheerful tones, that he was not so certain of the ultimate result as he pretended to be. Moreno came to see her every day too. She had conceived a strong liking for the black-browed young journalist. Moreover, she had great faith in him. Guy, of course, was her king amongst men. But she was not so hopelessly in love that she could not distinguish between the mental qualities of the two. Guy was very intelligent. He could snatch at the hints of others, and shape his course of conduct on them. But Moreno had a subtle and penetrating intellect, a touch of genius, and he combined inspiration with prudence. If Guy talked cheerfully when he was with her, her fears and doubts revived on his departure. Could he look all round and accurately weigh the chances? When Moreno told her to cheer up and promised that all would be well, she felt fortified. There was a sureness, a quiet power about the man that raised her drooping spirits. "You are sure that you will beat them? You are sure you will save Guy?" she had asked him one day when he had paid her a brief visit. He spoke very deliberately. "I have outwitted them once before." He looked a little gloomy as he spoke. It went to his kind heart to recall that, on that occasion, he had been compelled to sacrifice that charming young Frenchwoman, Valerie Delmonte. "I shall outwit them again, believe me." His tone was very confident, Isobel thought. "I am sure you will lay your plans very well, Mr. Moreno, but there is many a slip between the cup and the lip. The cup will be carried to the lip this time without a falter." He spoke with his usual assurance. "Guy always speaks cheerfully too," said Isobel in her simple, straightforward way. "But I am always doubtful when he leaves me. Mr. Rossett does not know what is in my mind, Miss Clandon, and I dare not tell him for reasons of my own. An incautious confidence might utterly frustrate my plans. I have many helping me, but I have close at hand a man who is going to be my ablest lieutenant. Strange to say, you know that man well." Isobel lifted up to him startled eyes. "You bewilder me. I know so few people." "It will surprise you to know that your cousin, Maurice Farquhar, is in Madrid at the present moment, and waiting to receive my instructions." "Maurice Farquhar in Madrid," she repeated. "But why? But why?" "Because I wanted to have a clear-brained, resolute Englishman at my right hand when the supreme moment came. I can't tell you everything. I daren't tell you much. Would you like to see your cousin? I can manage it easily." "Oh, I would love to," replied Isobel promptly, speaking according to the dictates of her open, generous nature. Then she suddenly remembered that Guy had expressed a certain jealousy of her cousin. "But perhaps at the moment it might not be prudent. I am here incognita, in a rather difficult situation. Later on, perhaps." From those few halting phrases, Moreno guessed accurately enough what was passing in her mind. She had a sincere affection for her cousin, who came over here to assist her at the greatest personal inconvenience. But she would not see him in case his visit might give offence to her lover. It is ever thus that self-sacrifice in love is rewarded. "I quite understand," he said.
Well, Farquhar is a white man, a man in 1,000. I wrung a promise from him some time ago that he would come over here to help me save Mr. Rossett. You can guess why he gave me that promise." "Yes," answered Isobel in a low voice. "I can guess why he gave that promise. He wanted to help me. You cannot tell how mean I felt. Oh, I think I will risk it. Please ask him to come and see me." Moreno shook his head. "No, better not to risk it. Farquhar is content to do good by stealth. We cannot be quite sure of the view the other gentleman might take of it if it came to his ears." Isobel felt a frightful coward, but she was relieved by Moreno's words. Guy was very impetuous and terribly jealous. She could not afford to rouse his suspicions. He left her feeling a little miserable and self-reproachful. Why could not men take a broad-minded view of things? Even if a girl were engaged, it did not follow that she should not be allowed to have a faithful friend. She had grown very weary of Madrid. She hated the place and the people under these most unhappy circumstances. The good-natured Mrs. Godwin had done her best to amuse her. She had taken her to the Museo del Prado, and pointed out to her the masterpieces of Velasquez, Murillo, Ribera, and other great masters. She had conducted her down the animated plaza of the Puerta del Sol. She had shown her the view from the Capillo de las Bastillas. They were too late for the carnivals, and to a bullfight Isobel would not go. Moreno betook himself to the quarters of Farquhar. He found the self-contained young barrister stretched on a sofa, reading a French novel. Farquhar was already a bit tired of it. On reflection, he was not quite certain if he had not been a little foolish in giving that promise. He had rushed over to Spain to help a man whose only claim to consideration lay in the fact that he had taken away from him the woman he wanted for his wife. Then he thought of the charming Lady Mary, her warm praise and flattering words. When he got back to England and recounted his exploits to her, he was sure he would receive a very warm welcome. Farquhar threw down his book and lighted a cigarette. "Well, my good friend, things seem devilish slow just now. Is anything going to happen shortly?" Moreno nodded. "Things will happen the evening after tomorrow. Curb your impatience till then." "You have got it all cut and dried, then?" "I think so. Tomorrow morning I will take you to my excellent friend the Chief of Police, and tell him that you represent me. We will spend an hour or two afterwards in discussing our plans. I have just come from Miss Clandon." "Ah," said Farquhar with affected carelessness. That name had still power to thrill him, in spite of Lady Mary. "Did you find her quite well?" "Perfectly, so far as her health is concerned, but naturally full of doubts and fears. I told her you were here. She was, of course, greatly surprised. She expressed a wish to see you." This, of course, was not the strict truth, but Moreno always wanted to make everybody feel happy and comfortable. A pleased expression stole over the man's face. "Oh, she said that, did she?" Moreno did not answer the question directly. "I pointed out to her that, in my opinion, such a meeting might be extremely dangerous, and that it is essential you should lie very low." Farquhar accepted the glib explanation. Moreno had one of the greatest qualities of a diplomatist, that he could impress nearly everybody with his sincerity. Next morning the two men interviewed the Chief of Police, or rather the Chief of Police by appointment interviewed them at the journalist's modest lodgings. In the course of that interview many things were explained at length. Moreno, always cautious, always on the lookout for accidents, stood by the window, keeping a vigilant eye on passers-by. Farquhar and the Chief sat at the far end of the room. Suddenly he espied the tall form of Contraras nearing the house. He bundled his guest into his bedroom. "The old devil! I had a suspicion he might turn up. It is quite safe here. If I give a loud whistle, get under the bed." But Contraras did not pay a long visit. He did not even sit down. He had only strolled round to ascertain that things were going right. Moreno, resolutely avoiding details, assured him that everything was in train. On the evening after tomorrow, Guy Rossett would be delivered into the hands of the Brotherhood, to be dealt with as they thought fit. Contraras left well pleased. Moreno was certainly a great acquisition to the organization. When he was well out of sight, the two men were brought out of the bedroom. The Chief of Police shook his fist vindictively in the direction of the vanished figure. "I was itching to take the old scoundrel straight away, Mr. Moreno," he remarked. The journalist smiled. "Impetuosity never pays, Signor. You could have proved nothing if you had. A most respectable old gentleman, highly connected through his wife with some of the best families in the country, pays me a visit to inquire after my health, or perhaps to ask me to dinner at his hotel. You would not have made much out of it." The chief cooled down immediately under this sensible speech. "You are a very wonderful man, Mr. Moreno. You never allow yourself to be carried away by your feelings." He turned with his gracious foreign manner to Farquhar. "I understand, sir, you are an old and trusted friend. I have no doubt that you have the same faith in his judgment that I have." On the afternoon of that same day, Moreno went to see Violet Hargrave. He found her restless and agitated. "You are sure that it will take place tomorrow night?" was her first question. "I am as near sure as can be. Unless a miracle happens, he will be brought up for judgment before the Brotherhood," was the answer. Violet shuddered. Her face went pale. "I have never been at one of their so-called trials, but it must be very horrible." "Neither have I," said Moreno. "I see, like myself, you don't anticipate much pleasure from it." "But you are going to save him, and I am going to help you," she cried a little wildly. "You have not yet told me where I come in. The time is very short. You will have to speak soon. Why not speak now?" The young man hesitated for a few seconds. How far should he trust her? Caution whispered, not too far. He spoke in a gloomy tone. "To tell you the truth, I am not so sure of saving him as I was. Certain things have happened which I had not taken into my calculations." He was watching her narrowly as he spoke, to note the effect upon her of his words. She clasped her hands together, and her voice faltered. "I am so in the dark. You tell me nothing. You keep everything to yourself." She betrayed great agitation, but it was evident she believed his statements implicitly. As a matter of fact, nothing had occurred to upset Moreno's plans in the slightest degree. But there was something about which he had been a little careless. He had pretty well secured his own safety, but he had not secured hers. "I cannot enter into a lot of explanations when circumstances alter from hour to hour," he said rather brusquely. "On the whole, I believe I have a better chance of saving him without your cooperation. Now, please, don't ask me why I think so." "I won't, if you don't wish it," she answered submissively. "I wish you could have been more frank with me, have given me some hint of what you intend to do. It will be very terrible for me to be there, waiting on the turns of events." "You no longer desire revenge on Guy Rossett?" he asked, looking at her intently. "Not that sort of revenge," she answered truthfully, "for I suppose murder is in their thoughts." "I had a brief talk with Contraras this morning. He came round to my rooms. He was more frank than he usually is with his subordinates. I suppose he was pleased with the way in which I have, so far, conducted the affair. He thought there would be great difficulty in getting hold of Guy Rossett." "Will you tell me some day why you found it easy?" "Some day, perhaps, but not now. To return to our chief, Contraras. He explained to me that he has no desire to remove this particular man if he will fall into line with him. He frankly admits that he is too small game, that he would willingly avoid the odium that such a deed would bring on the Brotherhood." "Ah!" Violet was very interested now. "If he falls in line with him, what does that mean? Or perhaps," she added bitterly, "there is another secret that is to be hidden from me." "Not at all," was the quiet answer. "I usually keep my own secrets, but I am not always so scrupulous with regard to the secrets of others. Contraras is going to offer him two alternatives. The first is that he resigns from the Embassy on some plausible pretext, and takes a solemn oath to do nothing to thwart the Brotherhood. The other alternative you can guess." "Death," whispered Violet in a hollow voice, and her face went as pale as death itself. "And you can guess what Rossett's answer will be?" said Moreno, breaking the long silence that ensued between them after those significant words. "I know, I know. He will choose death unless you can save him." The woman in her came suddenly to the surface, and she broke down, sobbing bitterly. Moreno looked at her steadily, but not unkindly, for a long time. Her emotion was genuine enough, he was sure. When the dastardly project had only been in the air, so to speak, she had not realized the full horror of it. Now that it was so near to accomplishment, she was stricken with remorse for having harboured such revengeful thoughts. And presently he spoke again in his quiet, deliberate accents. "By a miracle it may be possible for me to save him, if I can outwit them." "But cannot I help you? I know you do not believe much in the capacity of women, but I am not a fool, and in a crisis I believe my nerves are steady. If it is fated for me to succeed, I shall better work alone. But I would like to ask you this. It will be a cruel ordeal for you to be present at this scene, especially at the moment when you will be called upon to record your vote as a member of the tribunal. Would you be grateful to me if I could save you from that ordeal?" "Very, very grateful," sobbed the now sorely stricken woman. "But it is impossible. I have seen Contraras today also. He has arranged for Alvedero to fetch me tomorrow evening, and to conduct me to that awful house where we are to receive Guy Rossett. It is impossible." "There are very few things in this world that are impossible," said Moreno a little impatiently. "The first idea I had was that you would frankly throw yourself on the compassion of Contraras. Tell him that this man was once your lover, and that you must be excused from taking part in the proceedings on the ground of common humanity. The question is, would that work? It might, because I know he is still remorseful about the fate of Valerie Delmonte. But we are not sure. He is a fanatic of the deepest dye." "Absolutely a fanatic," corroborated Mrs. Hargrave. "To him the welfare of the brotherhood is the one supreme thing. All human emotions must be subjugated, all consideration of friends and kindred swept aside in pursuance of the one object." "I am disposed to agree," said Moreno. "Contraras' sense of compassion is a doubtful factor. We will discard that idea. Will you put yourself in my hands?" She looked intently into the dark, brilliant eyes, and what she read there reassured her. He was stubbornly secretive, but he was kind and sympathetic. He was ready to do his best to serve her. "Yes, I will," she said bravely. "I trust you." "Good. Then that is settled. Alvedero will call for you tomorrow evening as arranged, but you will not accompany him. He will come alone." "How are you going to do it?" she cried breathlessly. Her admiration for the man had grown intensely during the last few days. He seemed able to work miracles. "I shall keep that a secret, too, till tomorrow morning, when I shall be round at 11 o'clock. If I told you now, you would not get a wink of sleep all night." "I shall not get a wink of sleep as it is," she answered. But secretive to the last, Moreno was not to be tempted into frankness. "Oh, yes, you will. Anyway, you have promised to leave yourself in my hands. Tomorrow morning at 11 o'clock." They shook hands without another word. Moreno walked back to his lodgings, reflecting deeply. Was this attractive young woman really as bad as he had once thought? Was she not rather a creature of strong passions, of impulses at times ungovernable? Were there not in her womanly feelings that could be cherished and fostered by sympathetic companionship? Anyway, if she followed his instructions as she had agreed to do, he had secured her safety as well as his own. And that would be a result that would gratify him exceedingly. End of chapter 20. Recording by Tom Weiss, Tom'sAudiobooks.com. Chapter 21 of Whither Thou Goest by William le Queux. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Tom Weiss. Chapter
21. Save for a little impatience when his judgment was impugned, or somebody questioned the soundness of his opinions, Moreno was a person of the most equable temperament, and singularly light-hearted. Still, when he rose early on the morning of this most eventful day, he was in a very grave and thoughtful mood. He was playing a most difficult and dangerous game. Even if he outwitted the heads of the Brotherhood in Spain, as he believed he had, there was left Lucue and Jacques in London to deal with. To save Guy Rossett was easy enough. He had laid his plans very surely for that. But he had to save himself, also to save Violet Hargrave. In the plausible explanations that he would have to give in London, there must be no loopholes. Very early in the morning he again saw the Chief of Police, in company with Farquhar, who, now that the game was really afoot, was manifesting a keen interest in the chase. They rehearsed the whole programme all over again. "He is cleverer than I thought him at first," whispered Moreno to his friend, when the somewhat stout man had withdrawn for a moment to consult one of his lieutenants. "But I am relying on you to be constantly at his elbow. You are not the sort of chap to get flurried." And Farquhar, although quite a modest kind of fellow, agreed that he could keep his head in a crisis. At 11 o'clock, as arranged, Moreno presented himself at the lodgings of Mrs. Hargrave. She looked very pale, and there were dark rings round her eyes. It was easy to see that her night had been a perturbed one, that she had enjoyed little or no sleep. "You don't look in the best of health and spirits," he said kindly. "Well, you have got to pluck up your courage. You will have plenty of it for the next 24 hours. She shivered. "If I had known what I was going in for, I would never have yielded to Jacques' entreaties," she said. "You never quite know what you will be landed in when you embark in these enterprises," answered the man lightly. "Well, now to business. You still want to be absent from that meeting tonight?" "If it is possible." "It is quite possible. But you will have to rely on me, and you will also have to be very brave." He drew out of his pocket a small, dark-coloured vial, and held it to the light. "You see that?" he asked. "Well, this is going to be your salvation." She shivered again. Her nerves were very much out of order this morning, but she began to have an idea of what he was driving at. "This is the secret, then, that you would not tell me last night? I have got to drink that?" Moreno nodded. "Yes, if you are still in the same mind as you were yesterday. In my very early youth I was apprenticed to a chemist. I very soon began to acquire a wide knowledge of drugs and their properties." They had been standing up to the present. Moreno pointed to a sofa. "We can talk more easily if we sit. I have mixed you here a perfectly safe compound, which I want you to drink before I leave, so that I can take away the bottle. I would prefer it was not left lying about, you understand." She looked at him with eyes that expressed a great dread. "What effect will it have?" "I tell you frankly, about 6 or 7 o'clock you will feel very ill, very faint. Those effects will last for the best part of 12 hours. A few hours after that you will be yourself again." She looked at him narrowly. A dark wave of suspicion had suddenly flowed over her mind. She was sure, with a woman's certain intuition, that he was greatly attracted by her. Still, she knew nothing of him. He had always said he was a true son of the Revolution, although she had somewhat distrusted the sincerity of that statement. Had he, out of loyalty to the cause, revealed her perfidy to others, and was he deputed by them to poison her, under the specious pretext of falling in with her wishes? He read her dark, suspicious thoughts as easily as he would have read an open book. He spoke very gently, very tenderly. She had never appealed to him more than at this moment, with her pallid cheeks, the haunting dread in her eyes. "My dear, you do not trust me, I can see. Your mind is full of doubt. Well," he stooped and kissed her, "I can only swear by everything I hold holy and sacred, that I would not harm a hair of your head. No man could lie so convincingly as that." She reached out her hand for the vial, then quickly drew it back. "I am afraid, dreadfully afraid," she murmured in a low voice. "I don't know which to choose, to do as you tell me, or to go to that dreadful place." "You must do as you please." He was still very patient,
but she noticed there was a certain coldness in his tones. She rose and walked about the room, wringing her hands. Her faith in him had come back, but she was still terribly afraid. "It is early yet," said Moreno presently. "You will have plenty of time to send round for Contraras and throw yourself on his compassion. Implore him not to compel you to assist at the condemnation, perhaps the execution, of a man who was once your lover. He might give way." "The last thing he would do. He would think it was a grand opportunity to show my fidelity to the cause. He would let nothing stand in the way if it were his own case." "I agree with you now as I agreed before when we discussed the same subject. Well, you must make up your mind. Take this or wait here, and come with Alvedero tonight." She was still wavering, torn between faith and doubt. "But you said you could save Guy Rossett. Is there any doubt of that?" And Moreno, out of his pity for the woman, out of the attraction she possessed for him, spoke more plainly than he had intended. "There is great doubt of it. But even if I could save Guy Rossett, I doubt if I could save you. I might just manage to save myself." And then, in a flash, she understood, and she doubted him no longer. "I think I see it all now. You are no more a true son of the cause than I am a true daughter. I sold their secrets for money. You would betray them for the same or other reasons." Moreno did not answer the question directly. He simply held out the vial towards her. "Will you drink this or not?" She took it from him with a hand that no longer trembled. "Yes, I believe you now. I will drink it. Tell me what I am to do, how I am to act when it begins to take effect." "Do nothing. Just go to the sofa and lie down. In a few minutes you will be in a stupor, unconscious of everything and everybody. Your landlady may come up. She can act as she pleases, send for a doctor or not. Probably nobody will come near you till Alvedero arrives. When he sees you there, he can act as he pleases too. Anyway, he cannot stay long, because he will be due at the Brotherhood, to whom he will bring the report of your sudden indisposition." "And if the doctor comes, will he not guess?" "Dios!" cried Moreno, relapsing for a moment into Spanish. "You will be all right again long before the doctor has picked out your complaint from a dozen others that present similar symptoms." She pulled the cork from the vial and sniffed the contents. "There is no odour about it," she said. "Not the slightest," said Moreno quietly. "I took very good care of that. I think if the doctor does come, he will be a bit puzzled." She drank it down at a draught, then handed the bottle back to her visitor. "I am an adventuress, and you are, well, a sort of adventurer," she said with a half smile. "Well, you see, I have given you a proof of my faith in you." Moreno put the vial into his pocket and held out his hand. "Goodbye for the present." "Shall I see you tomorrow?" asked Violet as she walked with him to the door. "You say after 12 hours I shall be myself again." "Certainly," answered Moreno in his gayest tones. Yes, whatever betided, he would certainly see her tomorrow. Her trust in him had made her more attractive than ever. On the whole, he thought he had done the best for her. Once he had thought of getting the Spanish police to arrest her on some false charge, with the view of letting her go as soon as all danger was past. But this method did not appeal to him very greatly. The police would be glad enough to get her into their clutches, but they might not care to let her go so easily. Too much explanation might be necessary in the first instance. And he always had to adapt his policy to the view of what questions might be asked in London. The tale she could tell now would be a very simple one. She had been attacked in the evening by a sudden seizure, had relapsed into unconsciousness, and been oblivious of everything till the next day. That evening, at a few minutes past 9, Alvedero knocked at the door of the mean house. When the landlady opened it, he perceived that she was in a great state of agitation. "Oh, Signor, something terrible has happened. I went up to Madame's room some 20 minutes ago, to take her light supper. She was lying unconscious on the sofa, and she has not stirred since." Alvedero bounded up the stairs, entered the room, and gazed on the motionless form. At first he thought she was dead, but on placing his hand on her heart, he could feel it beating. "She looks as if she were dying. Have you sent for a doctor?" Yes, after I found that I could not pull her round, I sent my husband to fetch the first one he could find." Alvedero reflected as to his course of action. Humanity suggested that he should stay by the side of the insensible woman till the doctor arrived and gave his opinion as to her condition. But humanity was not a particular trait of the Brotherhood, and Alvedero had less of it than most of his colleagues. He had arrived 5 minutes late. He had spent another 5 minutes here. If he left at once, he would still be keeping his colleagues waiting. Besides, what good could he do? If the woman were not dying, as he believed she was, it must be hours before she recovered. The tribunal must sit without her. The sooner he went and informed them of that fact, the better. He turned towards the door and spoke a few parting words to the landlady. "Don't leave her till the doctor comes. Obey whatever instructions he gives you promptly. I will see that you are rewarded for your trouble. I will look in again in 2 or 3 hours from now. Please sit up for me." He walked a few yards down the street where a cab was waiting. He entered it and was driven rapidly towards an obscure portion of the town. Half an hour later Isobel was sitting in the drawing-room alone. Her host and hostess had gone on a visit to some friends who lived near. Guy had not been able to see her during the day, as he had been too busily engaged with his official duties. He had sent round a note telling her he would be round in the evening. She was expecting him every minute. There was a tap at the door. The maid entered with a letter. The gentleman who had brought it was waiting in the hall for an answer. She recognized the handwriting on the envelope at once as that of her cousin, Maurice Farquhar. She tore it open and read the few penciled words. "I want to see you at once. It is about Mr. Rossett." She rushed out into the hall and almost pulled him into the room. "What is it?" she panted in terrified tones. "Something has happened to Guy." "Yes, something has happened, but you must be brave and not give way. He has been trapped by the anarchists, but all will be well. Moreno assures me that he has foreseen this and will save him. I am now on my way to do my share in the rescue." "Can I come with you?" pleaded Isobel. "I shall go mad if I stop here." For a moment Farquhar hesitated. He had a rooted dislike to women mixing themselves up in dangerous or turbulent scenes, but her pleading eyes overcame his scruples. "Yes, if you wish. I have a cab waiting. Leave a note for these people here explaining your absence. Then put on your things and come with me. I will explain everything as we go along." A few minutes later they were seated side by side, driving to the same obscure quarter of the town which had long ago been reached by the Spaniard anarchist Alvedero. End of chapter 21. Recording by Tom Weiss, Tom'sAudiobooks.com. Chapter 22 of Whither Thou Goest by William Le Queux. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Tom Weiss. Chapter 22. In a shabby room of a shabby house, in one of the most obscure quarters of Madrid, 5 men were sitting. They were Contraras, Zorrilta, Alvedero, Moreno, and Somoza, the fisherman of Fontarrabia. "Guy Rossett is here in the next room." It was Moreno who spoke. He turned to the fisherman. "Has he recovered sufficiently, Somoza?" The fisherman answered. "He is still a little bit dazed a minute ago when I left him. The handkerchief I flung over his face contained a pretty strong dose. I should give him another 10 minutes before he is ready to face the tribunal." The capture had been easy. Guy Rossett, reckless of danger, had left his flat to pay his visit to Isobel Clandon. 2 members of the secret police were ready to accompany him. Fearful of compromising Isobel, he had rather roughly dispensed with their services. Reluctantly, they had obeyed him. They agreed between themselves that an Englishman was always pig-headed, a bit of a daredevil, and inclined to take risks. Guy walked carelessly along. He was in rather good spirits. He had received that day a cheerful note from Moreno that everything was going well, that very soon the heads of the anarchist movement in Spain would be laid by the heels. Of course, in this letter, Moreno did not explain his methods. If he had done so, Guy might not have been in quite such high spirits. For at this moment, playing his very difficult game of saving Guy Rossett, saving himself and Violet Hargrave, and also snaring the anarchist, Moreno could only give his full confidence to one man, his old friend and companion, Maurice Farquhar. As a matter of fact, Rossett never knew what had really taken place that night. He was never told that Moreno knew of his projected visit to Isobel that evening from a random remark of hers dropped in the afternoon, that he had set Somoza and another tall Biscayan fisherman to follow him for the purpose of bringing him to the house where the heads of the anarchist movement were assembled in solemn conclave. Rossett walked gaily along. He would have a precious hour with Isobel. In a dark street 2 men came up behind him. One pinioned his arms from behind. Somoza pressed a saturated handkerchief over his face. In a few seconds the unfortunate young diplomatist was drugged and helpless. A cab driven by a member of the Brotherhood had crawled slowly after the 2 men. As soon as the driver saw what had happened, he drove rapidly up. The 2 powerful men lifted the inert body into the vehicle. He was partially recovered when they halted at the house where the tribunal of Queux was sitting to pronounce judgment on the man who had dared to thwart their plans. They locked him in a room adjoining that in which Contraras was presiding over the deliberations of his 5 trusted lieutenants. After locking him in securely, Somoza went to report the matter to Moreno. His colleague, the other Biscayan fisherman, remained on guard outside the closed door for fear of untoward accidents. Rossett was a powerful man. Contraras, with his fine intellectual face, his hair in places turning from iron grey to white, looked the embodiment of dignified justice. Perhaps in his warped and fanatical mind he believed he was. He spoke in his most judicial accents. Nobody shall ever say that he has not had a fair trial when brought up before the tribunal of the Brotherhood. We will wait an hour if it is necessary for this misguided young man to recover his senses. Moreno, who had arrived the last of the party, looked round with a sudden start. "Where is our comrade, Violet Hargrave?" Contraras hastened to explain. "Ah, of course you have not heard. Alvedero went to bring her here, according to arrangement. He found her stretched on the sofa, motionless and inanimate. He thinks she is in a dying condition. He is going round to inquire after these proceedings are over." "This is very sad," said Moreno in his gravest manner. "And she is such a nice woman personally, and so devoted to the cause through the influence of Jacques. I wonder," he cast an inquiring look at Alvedero, "if by any chance she drinks or drugs. Many apparently nice women do." Alvedero shook his big head. "I doubt it. I should say a seizure of some sort. Perhaps her heart is weak. She looks a little fragile." Moreno, for obvious reasons, did not pursue the subject. Violet Hargrave's absence had evidently excited no comment, no suspicion. A quarter of an hour had elapsed. Somoza was deputed to enter the locked room and ascertain the condition of the prisoner. Contraras was resolved to proceed justly according to his interpretation of the word justice. Somoza returned after his inspection and reported that the effects of the saturated handkerchief had worn off. Guy Rossett was, in a sense, clothed in his right mind. He was fit to face the tribunal. The members of the conclave assumed masks. Somoza had worn a mask when he had entered the locked room. Whatever happened, it was essential that Guy Rossett should not be able to identify any one of them. The prisoner, or captive, whatever he might be called, was brought in. In the cab he had been bound securely round the legs and wrists, but not painfully. He was assisted to a chair by the masked Somoza, where he sat facing his judges. His face was a little pale, due to the effects of the chloroform, but his demeanour was firm. He felt himself in a very tight corner, but he had been assured so often by Moreno that he need never despair. A good angel, in the shape of Moreno himself, was watching over him. He cast his glance rapidly over the masked men confronting him. Where was the black-browed young journalist whom he had known in the old days? There, on the right, nearest to the door. Had that position been chosen by accident or design? He recognized at once the short, squat figure. Through the holes of the mask he could see the gleam of those dark eyes. His demeanor would be more indomitable than ever. Contraras opened the proceedings in his most judicial manner. "Mr. Rossett, you will recognize that you are now at the mercy of the Brotherhood, against whom for some time you have directed your activities." "Quite true," replied Guy Rossett in his curtest manner. Whatever fate was in store for him, he was not going to knuckle under to this crew of bloodthirsty ruffians. Contraras continued in his calm, imperturbable manner. "I cannot say that, up to the present, you have done us very much harm, but still you are a menace to our schemes, our aspirations. I am pleased to hear that I am of sufficient importance to justify this mock tribunal." Rossett waved his hand contemptuously at the masked men sitting in judgment on him. The eyes of Contraras flashed through his mask. He took his position very seriously. "Mr. Rossett, let me advise you in your own interest not to carry matters with too high a hand. Kindly recognize your position. If you were seated in the Calle Fernando el Santo, I admit you would be top dog. At the present moment the Brotherhood, here in this obscure house, in this obscure quarter of the city of Madrid, is in that enviable situation." A bitter retort was on Rossett's lips, but he thought he perceived an almost imperceptible gesture of warning from the short, squat figure in the corner near the door. He temporized. "The fortunes of war, I admit, are with you, sir. I am sorry I have not had the advantage of knowing whom I have the honour to address." Contraras was at heart a gentleman. He felt the sting of the rebuke. "Mr. Rossett, if you come into line with us tonight, I may deal with you quite frankly. Before we separate, you may know as much about me as I do about you." There was an obvious movement on the part of Zorrilta and Alvedero. They evidently thought their chief was going too far. Contraras hushed the incipient rebellion with an authoritative wave of his hand. "Gentlemen, kindly leave me to deal with this matter. Mr. Rossett and I will understand each other in a very few moments." He turned towards the young diplomatist, still undaunted in the midst of this hostile crowd. "Mr. Rossett, you have much to lose by opposing us, perhaps life itself. By withdrawing from this unequal contest, and believe me, it is unequal, you have much to gain." "I am not so sure it is unequal," answered Guy Rossett stubbornly. He had perceived too late the warning signal of Moreno, anxious that the somewhat uncertain Contraras should not be deflected from his present calm, judicial mood. But Contraras kept his temper. "Mr. Rossett, you are a young man, with life, a happy and prosperous life, before you. I know a good deal about you. It is my business to know much about other people. You are engaged to a very charming girl. You will inherit a great fortune from a wealthy aunt. And if you could establish your principles," broke in Guy, speaking with some heat, "you might take away from me my fiancée. You would certainly rob me of my fortune." But Contraras was still patient. He was trying to reason with this obstinate young man, whose bold bearing moved his admiration. "We cannot tell how the great revolution will shape itself ultimately. But let us deal with present facts. A charming girl is waiting for you, longing for the moment when she can be your wife." A shadow of pain passed over Guy's face. Tonight he had set out to visit his beloved Isobel, and he had been snared. Contraras watched him naturally through the eyes of his mask. "And a big fortune will be yours very shortly. Are you prepared to give up these advantages for the sake of thwarting the Brotherhood?" "I rather think I am. But tell me what you propose. I admit you are arguing in a most temperate fashion, but you have something up your sleeve all the same." "I have," admitted Contraras frankly. "Mr. Rossett, believe me, I have no personal animosity against you, except as the tool of a decaying and effete system. Come into line with me and your bonds shall be loosed, and you shall go forth a free man." "Your conditions?" queried Rossett in a hard voice. "Take your solemn oath, no, Give me your word as an English gentleman, I will accept that you will resign your position at the Embassy and take no further action against the Brotherhood." He rose and pointed at the door. "Give me that promise, Mr. Rossett, and you can walk out a free man." If Guy hesitated a moment, his hesitation must be pardoned. In that swift instant he thought of Isobel, anxiously waiting his arrival, his dear sister Mary, anxious and troubled also, even his father, whose maladroit interference in his affairs had sent him into this hotbed of disaffection. Then he spoke slowly and deliberately. "You invite me to dishonour myself in order to secure my own personal safety. My answer is, no, do your worst." "You will not reconsider that decision, Mr. Rossett?" Guy shook his head. "No, 1,000 times no. Do what you like with me. I am a defenceless man. You can murder me here and probably hush up your crime. But I shall be avenged. You can reckon on that." Contraras rose and paced the room in great agitation. He was a brave man himself. He admired the quality of bravery in others. Fanatical and resolute as he was, it went against the grain to condemn this young Englishman to death because he would not accept the dishonourable terms offered to him. "Mr. Rossett, I wish to spare you. The Brotherhood does not condemn in haste." He turned to Somoza. "Take this gentleman to his room, and bring him here in a quarter of an hour. Perhaps by that time he will take a more reasonable view of his position." "Come, Signor, if you please," said the obedient Somoza, speaking through his mask in the most polite tones. "A Spaniard is always courteous, even if he is about to murder you." The fisherman bent down to assist his prisoner to rise, but before Rossett was firmly on his legs, the short, squat figure of Moreno got up from his chair. He laid his finger to his lips and looked round at the assembly. "Silence, gentlemen, for a moment. I am sure I heard the sound of a whistle. Yes, there is another one. Did you catch it?" No, nobody had caught it except Moreno. He stole gently to the window and pulled the blind an inch aside. He dropped it hastily and staggered back in a state of extreme agitation. In that apparently unconscious movement he had drawn nearer to the door. "Dios!" he cried in a shrill voice. "The house is surrounded. There are dozens of men outside." The pulling aside of the blind was a signal he had arranged with his friend, the head of the police. The pretence of the whistle was a blind. There was a heavy trampling on the stairs. Almost before he had ceased speaking, the locked door was burst open to admit the members of the police, with levelled revolvers covering the masked men. Two of the unwelcome visitors seized Somoza and handcuffed him. A third cut the secure but not painful ropes that bound Rossett and conducted him down the narrow staircase. A cab was waiting. His guardian bundled the young man in. Was it a dream? Isobel's soft arms were round him. Isobel's soft voice was whispering to him, "My darling, you are safe. Moreno has kept his promise." Rossett was bewildered. No wonder. He had hardly yet recovered from the effects of the drug which had been administered by Somoza. His head fell back on her shoulder. "Isobel, my dear sweetheart, you here, what does it mean?" "It means that you were saved through Moreno and my cousin Maurice Farquhar." She felt it was no time to palter with the truth. "Your cousin, Maurice Farquhar? What has he to do with it all?" She was pleased to note that there was no suspicion in his tones, only the expression of bewilderment. "Oh, it would take hours to explain, but I will cut it as short as I can. My cousin and Moreno are great friends. Maurice has come over here to help him. I was expecting you tonight, as you will remember. Maurice came round to explain that you had been kidnapped. He was coming on here as Moreno's lieutenant to help the police. I implored him to take me along, to welcome you when you escaped from them. He consented, and here I am." Guy clasped her in his arms. "You darling, and where is Mr. Farquhar? I would like to thank him." Isobel beckoned to a man standing a little way in the shadow. He advanced. "Maurice, Guy wishes to thank you for all your share in this night's work." The two men exchanged a cordial handshake. Guy muttered his thanks. "I would like to tell you to drive off straight away," said Farquhar, "but you must wait a minute or two. There will be a third occupant of this vehicle. Our friend Moreno, who is going to pass the night at the house of the Chief of Police. Tomorrow he will go to England." In the room from which Rossett had been conducted to his friendly guardian, the head of the police was taking the situation in hand. "Masks off, if you please, gentlemen," he cried out in stentorian tones. The men turned hesitatingly to each other, but the levelled revolvers had an eloquence that was very appealing. They tore off their masks and flung them on the floor. The chief scrutinized them in turn, offering audible comments. "Ah, Contraras, the dark horse of the conspiracy, connected with the Spanish nobility through your wife. I think I have met you at court. Alvedero, ah, for some time you have been suspect. Zorrilta, I know you well, governor of the province of Nava." He pointed to Somoza. "This gentleman I do not know. We shall find something about him later on." He turned to Moreno, who preserved an impassive demeanour. "I have not the honour of knowing this gentleman either," he said, with a splendid disregard of the truth, for which Moreno admired him immensely. "But no doubt I shall shortly atone for my ignorance. I shall have something to say to him later on." He turned to his subordinates. "Handcuff them, and take them along." Moreno all the time had been edging nearer to the door. Suddenly he pulled out a knife and hurled himself at the man who was guarding it. The man went down before the apparently savage onslaught. Moreno rushed down the stairs. "After him!" yelled the chief. "Don't let that man escape!" 3 of the waiting men clattered down the stairs after the flying Moreno. They returned a few moments later, crestfallen. They explained that he had flown like the wind, that they had lost him in the darkness. The chief swore roundly and cursed them. "Dolts! Idiots!" he cried fiercely. "You have let him slip through your fingers. I believe he is the most dangerous man of the lot." He was certainly playing his part splendidly. It had, of course, all been rehearsed. The man on whom Moreno had sprung had fallen down of his own accord. The men who had been dispatched to pursue him had lost him on purpose. Farquhar met him at the door of the shabby house, and piloted him to the cab in which Guy, Rossett, and Isobel were seated. "Here is the third passenger," he said. Moreno got in and looked triumphantly at the two. "Well, what do you think of the English Secret Service?" he cried in exultant tones. "Mr. Rossett is saved, I have escaped without suspicion, and my good friend the Chief of Police will make a splendid haul upstairs. He played up splendidly. Well, I think after tonight the anarchist movement will have a big setback in Spain." The cab drove along. Isobel was deposited at the Godwins. Rossett was put down at his own flat. Moreno was conveyed to the residence of the Chief of Police, where he was to pass the night. A telegram was awaiting Guy. It was from his sister Mary. "I was summoned to Aunt Henrietta this morning. She had passed away before I had arrived." End of chapter 22. Recording by Tom Weiss, tomsaudioBooks.com. Chapter 23 of Whither Thou Goest by William le Queux. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Tom Weiss. Chapter 23. The next morning, Guy, Rossett, and Farquhar were admitted to a private audience of the King. A gracious message had been transmitted to Moreno through the agency of the Chief of Police. It would not have been very politic on the part of that enterprising young man to show himself at the palace. His Majesty thanked them both warmly for their services, and was very interested in the details which they gave him of that eventful evening. "I know England well and love it," he said. "As long as she breeds such sons as you, she will always remain the first of great nations. Last night's work was good. My poor country will have a more peaceful time now that we have laid these bloodthirsty scoundrels by the heels." Moreno's overpowering impulse was to get back to England as quickly as possible. But there was a certain duty to perform first. He must pay his promised visit to Violet Hargrave. He called about 11 o'clock. He found her looking pale and languid from the effects of the powerful mixture he had given her. Pulling round, he inquired as they shook hands. "I can see you are, but you won't be quite yourself for a few hours. Well, tell me what happened. I arrived late at the meeting and simply heard from Contraras that Alvedero had reported you were indisposed. But I learned no details and, of course, did not press for any. Did they fetch a doctor to you? If so, what is his verdict?" A faint smile spread over her pale face. "He has only left a few minutes ago. He came to the conclusion that I dosed myself with drugs. I allowed him to believe that I did. Of course, I have never drugged in my life." "A very clever man, an ornament to his profession," remarked Moreno dryly. "Still, how the devil should he guess, being totally ignorant of the circumstances? And the symptoms were precisely those which would have been produced by a long course of drugging." Mrs. Hargrave laid her hand upon his arm and spoke in a serious voice. "What of last night? There is nothing in the papers this morning. I have sent out for half a dozen. Tell me what happened." "The Brotherhood has been defeated again." He rehearsed the scene for her benefit, and came to the concluding portion. "Just as they were about to remove Rossett, I distinctly heard a low whistle that was repeated a few seconds later. I just pulled aside the curtain and saw that the house was surrounded. I had hardly put the blind back when the door was burst open and the police swarmed in. They cut Rossett loose and took him downstairs. They covered us with revolvers and made us take off our masks. The chief who was with them recognized Contraras, Zorrilta, and Alvedero. Myself and Somoza he did not recognize." "Ah!" Violet Hargrave drew a long breath. "You were the only one who escaped, then? How did you manage it?" "By a miracle. I always keep my head in a crisis. As soon as I heard them rushing up the stairs, I drew near to the door, hoping to escape in the confusion. It was, of course, 1,000 to 1 chance. While all the attention was being concentrated on Contraras and the others, of course the chief didn't expect to bag such a big game, I drew my knife, plunged it into the breast of the man guarding the door. I fear I killed him, poor fellow, flew down the stairs, knocked over another chap, and dodged through them." Violet Hargrave surveyed him critically. "I'm afraid you haven't a very high opinion of my intelligence. That is the story you will tell to Lucue, Maceda, and Jacques when we meet again in London. It does not impose upon me. You have escaped right enough, but you escaped with the connivance of the police." Moreno bit his lip. He had presumed a little too much upon feminine incredulity. "At any rate, you are not in their clutches," he said quietly. "I saved you. Don't forget that." She reached out her hand. "Please forgive me. I am very grateful for what you have done. Of course, if I had gone there, you could not have saved me. I should have been taken with the others. You could save Guy Rossett and yourself. Even your clever brain could not have taken in a third. I repeat, I am very grateful." Moreno retained her hand in his. Secretive as he was by nature, he felt that the time for dissimulation was past. "When we get to London, I am leaving tonight, and the sooner we make tracks the better, we will respect each other's secrets. I have still in my possession the photographed copy of that document which you sold to Guy Rossett." She drew away her hand from his with an indignant gesture. "Oh, you think I am utterly, irretrievably base!" she cried bitterly. "You think I would betray you after what you have done for me? Save me from death or a lifelong imprisonment?" She broke into wild sobbing. He put his arm round her and drew her gently towards him till her crying ceased. "My poor little Violet," he whispered gently, "let us speak together quite frankly. You are, on your own showing, an adventuress with, I believe, some very womanly instincts. Well, I am not quite sure that I am very much better. You sold the cause for money. I sold it for money too, plus conviction. I wonder if we could turn over a new leaf, lead a new life together." "If I could find somebody who really cared for me!" cried the pretty little blonde woman, still tearful. "Jacques loves me, I am sure, but just with the love of a father." "Well, I care for you," said Moreno, and this time he spoke without any reservation. Violet lifted her face to his, and their lips met. Then she shivered. "But how can we escape from this horrible brotherhood? Lucue and Jacques are left. They will exact their pound of flesh. They will snare us into equally dangerous enterprises." Moreno snapped his fingers. "Bah! If I have outwitted Contraras and the others, I will soon settle Lucue's hash. As to poor old Jacques, it won't take long to convince him that he is more safely employed in earning 100% on his capital than in trying to blow up respectable people who have certainly never injured him. The fate of the others will frighten him." Violet drew herself from his protecting arm and dried her eyes. "I think, dear, I can really turn into a good woman," she said plaintively. "You see, I have never had a proper chance. When I married Jack, and I was genuinely fond of him, I thought I had met a gentleman. Can you guess what he really was?" "A card sharper," suggested Moreno with his uncanny facility of guessing conundrums. Mrs. Hargrave nodded her blonde head. "You have hit it. A week after we were married, he told me all about himself. We were to take an expensive flat in Mount Street, and he would bring people there. He spent 3 weeks in teaching me an elaborate system of signalling. As a rule we played together, but he had another couple of confederates to ward off suspicion." "Did you tell Jacques of this?" "No, I was too ashamed. Jacques is, of course, a rogue in his own way, but not that way. He was opposed to the marriage at first, and I was keen on it. I made out that Jack was a man of good family and well off. I believed all he told me at the start. I didn't want to own that I had been taken in." "I quite understand," replied Moreno. "By the way, of course you didn't know that poor old Contraras is dead." "Contraras dead? How did he die?" "It appears that he always carried some poisoned tablets in his pocket in case of accidents. Before they handcuffed him, they are a bit slower here than in Paris or London, he swallowed one of them, and died as they took him downstairs. Poor old man, he was a terrible fanatic, but he was more honest than most of them. I don't suppose there will be much mourning in Fitzjohn's Avenue. I expect his family will be glad to have got rid of him." He kissed her very tenderly as he bade her good-bye. "A new life, little woman, from today?" "A new life from today," she repeated softly, "as long as I am sure that you really care." "I do care," replied Moreno, speaking with unusual fervour for a man of his cautious temperament. Of the London section of the Brotherhood little remains to be told. Shortly afterwards, Lucue was stabbed to death in a violent quarrel with a brother anarchist. Jacques and Maceda, alarmed at the fate of their Spanish colleagues, took but a perfunctory part in further propaganda. In 12 months' time, the London section had ceased to exist as an active force. On a mellow October day, a few months after those thrilling events in Madrid, Isobel was married in the quiet little church on her uncle's estates. It was in this church that her father had been christened. Her bridesmaids were Lady Mary and 2 cousins. Her uncle, the head of the family, gave her away. For the head of the family and his wife had behaved quite properly on the occasion. They had insisted that she should be married from their house, that she should have the whole-hearted support of her kindred. Such an arrangement suited her very well. Her bereavement had been so recent that the idea of a fashionable wedding would have been repugnant to her. Here in this quiet little church, where generations of Clandons had been christened, many of them married, she gave herself to the man of her choice. With the advent of his great-aunt's considerable fortune, Guy's brief fit of ambition died out. And it must be admitted that, although he had stuck gallantly to his post, and refused to show the white feather, his experience of diplomatic life had been more exciting than pleasant. So he severed his connection with the Foreign Office, having made up his mind to lead the easy and agreeable life of a man of wealth and position. They were to spend their honeymoon in Italy. On their return, they would renovate Aunt Henrietta's charming country residence in Hampshire, and take a house in London where they intended to spend a good deal of their time. For Guy was very proud of his beautiful Isobel, and he could see a time when she would become a very charming and popular hostess. The young couple drove away amidst the cordial greetings of the small company assembled. Only a few intimate connections of the 2 families remained. Moreno had been invited, but he had excused himself on some plausible pretext. He had no desire to thrust himself into an aristocratic milieu to which he was unaccustomed. He sent the bride a very handsome present, with a card on which was written, "From Andres Moreno, as a souvenir of thrilling times in Spain." When Lord Saxham was saying goodbye to the Clandons, Maurice Farquhar conducted Lady Mary to the car which was to drive them back to Ticehurst Park, a distance of about 50 miles. "You will not forget that you are due to us on the 25th, she reminded him as they shook hands. "Is it likely? I have been looking forward to it ever since you sent me the invitation." "I am looking forward to it too," said Mary softly, and a rather becoming colour swept over her cheek, making her look quite attractive. The Earl joined them and mounted the car. He waved his hand cheerfully as they drove off. "Not good-bye, but au revoir, Farquhar. See you on the 25th." He watched the car drive out of sight, thinking of many things. He had loved Isobel with all the fervour of first love, but Isobel was gone from him. And Mary was very sweet and attractive, and took no pains to conceal that she took great pleasure in his society. Well, perhaps some day. But even in his secret thought the young and ambitious barrister could hardly bring himself to believe that a girl of Mary's birth and long descent would give herself to a man who had only his brains to recommend him. Still, this younger generation of the Rossetts had a strange democratic strain in them. Guy had chosen his bride from the small squirearchy. It was openly rumoured in the clubs that, having come into a snug little income from great Aunt Henrietta, Lord Ticehurst had made up his mind to marry his chorus girl and defy his father. Lady Mary had also been well provided from the same kind source. She might prove as democratic as the others. And while Farquhar was ruminating over all these things, Isobel and her husband had set out on the first stage of their journey to the enchanted land of wedded romance. This is the end of Whither Thou Goest by William Le Queux. Recording by Tom Weiss, Tom'sAudiobooks.com.